Foreign Policy Publisher and CEO, Andrew Solinger.
How are you? So nice to see you. Thank you. After lunch, we need to bring the energy level up a little bit. And in fact, a lot of people are still eating lunch, so they'll come in shortly. But let me ask one more time. How are you today after lunch? Very good. Excellent. So this is the final of 4 forums and summits that FP is hosting here at UNGA this week. Yesterday, if you were here or not here, we did a program on healthcare, a fantastic program lasting all morning long. That was in the afternoon, followed by a discussion on food security, our Food Plus summit, which went very, very well. And this morning, we talked about technology. It is very fitting and appropriate that we close out our forum programming. We have more programming later, which I'll tell you about, but our forum programming with a discussion on the energy transition. Because all of those elements that I just described to you, food, health, food security, health, universal health, and technology and AI, all comes back to and wraps around the energy transition. It is the driver, and climate, the driver of all of the poly crisis that we face and the opportunities that we face as well. So I think there's no more fitting discussion for us to have as our concluding talking point. Couple things. There have been countless meetings this week on the energy transition. So what we hope to do today is wrap a lot of that up so we can bring away some of the learnings, what's been discussed, what we're worried about, and hopefully some of the things that we're hopeful and optimistic about. We're going to hear from energy experts, government officials, private sector leaders, and we're going to talk about environmental responsibility, energy security, social equity, and economic prosperity. As we transition, it's a weighty topic, so there's a lot to cover, and we'll kick off in 1 second. But first, I'd like to thank our partners who helped make this discussion possible. They are Anglo-American, Chemonics, Florida International University, and General Motors. We're very appreciative of all their work. Thank you. And we'll hear from them as well. And also, you can ask questions. We'd love for this to be interactive in the post-lunch environment also. That's helpful to keep you engaged. So I will cue you for that. If you do have any questions you'd like to ask, raise your hand. My colleague Claire will help you with a microphone. And if, by the way, if you're joining us online, you could submit your questions right on the website. There's a question box that you can submit. And if you'd rather not raise your hand, you could just use the QR code on the cards on your chair and submit those questions. And Claire will clear those and signal me, and I'll ask the question for you. And now I would like to dive into our first speaker, who I'm really proud to introduce. It's Dr. Fatih Birol, Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. He's had a very busy week, but he's been so generous about making some time for us. Please welcome Fatih Birol. How are you, sir? Thank you for joining us. Okay, let's get at it. So, Dr. Birol, the big news that I wanted to talk about was your upcoming World Energy Report. You did an op-ed in last week's Financial Times talking about the fact that this report, for the first time, is moving the peak fossil fuel date down to 2030, just around the corner, which is a big move. Would love to hear a little bit from you about why that's happening, why it's earlier than expected.
So first of all, many thanks for inviting me to this discussion. Now, at the IEA, we are an energy organization. And one of the beauties of working at the IEA is, in addition to being in Paris, I should say, we have all the energy data at our fingertips. If you ask me now, how much coal is used to produce cement in Indonesia, I can tell you in 5 minutes the answer. I can give you the answer how much solar PV is installed in Zimbabwe, or in the United States, in this oil field, how much oil is produced, or China's decision on electric cars. We have all the energy data in the world, number one. Number two, based on this data, when we look at this data, there is one trend which is coming in this world energy outlook, which is extremely clear. Namely, clean energy transition is happening, and happening faster, much faster than many people realize. Solar, huge increase around the world. It is not only US or Europe, everywhere. The leader is China, but also India, Indonesia, Africa, everywhere. Just to give you one example, this year, of all the power plants in the world installed, of all of them, more than 80% is renewable energies, mainly solar, and the rest all the other fuels put together.
New power plants.
New power plants. This year installed and built around the world. Second, electric cars. Very strong increase. Very strong increase. Only 2 years ago, 1 out of 25 cars sold in the world was electric. So 1 out of 25 2 years ago. And this year, it is 1 out of 5 cars sold as electric. And it is growing. Led by China again, but also in Europe, US, around the world. And many other clean energy technologies. And these are happening because not necessarily driven by climate reasons, but for they are becoming more economic and for energy security reasons. Now, looking at those numbers, especially what is happening in the solar and electric cars, and one more important element that we have to take into account, we see that the fossil fuels are going to peak. What is that element? It is the following. It is China. When you look at the last 10 years, China was responsible more than 2/3 of the global oil demand growth alone, China, globally, more than 1/3 of the global natural gas demand growth, and almost all the growth for coal. And Chinese economy, compared to last 10 years, as everybody, including the Chinese government, everybody agrees that Chinese economy is slowing down and changing. It is also structure from heavy structure of the economy, much lighter, which requires less energy. So putting this, at least 3 main elements together, solar, or renewables in general, big push. Then the second big electrification of the transportation sector, and Chinese economy slowing down put together, we see that the first coal, followed by oil, followed by gas, they are going to peak before 2030 and slowly decline. And this is, I think this is very important, this is without assuming new climate clean energy policies. If they come on top of that,
this is with the current regime of regulations.
Exactly, current regime of regulations, and if additional measures, policies come, for example, we have a COP28, the other, I don't know if there will be some international or national regulations, it will accelerate this decline. So this is a very important global trend. It will have implications for the oil investors. Of course, it changes this demand from region to region. But globally, we are seeing a new emerging energy economy.
So fantastic news. I would
depends on who you are.
Depends on who you are. So I'm going to play OPEC for a time now. In the shorter term, not affiliated with OPEC, don't know OPEC, not personal friends, but I'm taking OPEC's perspective. In the shorter term, you have also said, the IEA has also said, that global oil consumption will hit a new record this year of 101.8 million barrels a day, led by the Chinese demand that's will decrease that you're talking about, and Saudi, Russia production cuts, OPEC plus, that will leave global oil in a substantial deficit for the remainder of the year. How do you look at both of those and reconcile that? It's not as though we're in this steady decline. We still have a hill to climb.
Definitely. So first of all, you are right. Today we are seeing oil prices flirting with $100, which is, I think, an important risk for the global economy, especially for the emerging energy importing emerging countries, and the inflation numbers. It can push the inflation higher. Now, why oil is going to $100? Basically, there are 2 reasons for that. One, this year's demand, oil demand, is strong, mainly driven by China rebound from COVID. So this year we expect global oil demand will grow about 2 million barrels per day, more or less, and more than 60% China. But this rebound is finishing next year. So this is one driver. Second driver is Saudi Arabia and Russia, a group, coalition, decided to cut the production. Oil is there. It is not a matter of not having investment for new oil. Oil is there, but not produced. So we should be rather careful, all of us, looking at the numbers, not to mix between not to produce the oil from the fields which are already there is a deliberate policy decision and making investments for the future or not. So today, there are two drivers of the high oil prices. One, strong demand. And the second, this demand is not met by the producers as a result of deliberate production cuts. Very clear.
So as OPEC, what I would, and this is all, of course, incredibly, spot on, and news as of today. Russia has today announced that it will no longer export diesel fuel. It's one of the major diesel fuel exporters in the world, and oil is now above $100 a barrel. I think it's 101.2 when I last looked, just before coming out here, breaking news. So this is all very well and true. As OPEC, we would say that a narrative like this, saying that if we are talking about not investing in oil and gas, we are going to see chaos in the energy system, because we're not going to maintain. First, 80% of our current energy is derived from fossil fuels. How do we get to this smoothly, to this decline that you're talking about, if we just worry people that we should not invest at all in fossil fuels? We won't be able to meet the current demand.
What I would say to them, two things, or to you, since you are representing OPEC here. By the way, I worked for OPEC before. I'm a Thai, just to tell you that nobody's perfect.
This is a good career path for me.
So, now the first thing is, even the investment was 2 times higher, as long as you decide not to produce from those fields, you cannot change anything. It is a policy decision. And what I'm seeing is, unfortunately, geopolitics and energy is more and more interwoven. It is not a commercial decision. It's not a business decision. It is a geopolitical decision. Russia's decision today not to export diesel, 1 million barrels per day, this is Russia's domestic market will never ever absorb, because they say we are going to absorb domestically. It is impossible. I don't think it will be long-lived, but it is a signal to the markets. And again, the recent joint decisions and implementing of Russia and Saudi Arabia is something important to notice. The second thing is, I wish you mentioned OPEC, but in general, oil industry wouldn't misjudge not only the energy market trends, but what is discussed in the streets of the world. Who is responsible for climate change and the impacts of climate change? So if we have 1 or 2 summers like we experienced last summer, I think it will be much more clearer who is responsible for that. And the world will never forget who wanted to find a solution to climate change and the other way around.
Okay, well, as OPEC, I am now worried. So thank you for bringing up that point.
I really hope that OPEC countries, and one OPEC country is now hosting the COP28, and they are trying to find a solution to this issue of climate change. And this is, we are not, as we are not against oil or gas. Our problem is oil, gas, and coal are responsible more than 80% of the emissions causing climate change. This is the issue. This is we know that. So we all have the energy world, oil companies, renewables, policymakers. We have to all come together and find a solution. This is what we want to do.
You just referenced global populations, the summers that we've just had.
Yeah.
Do you sense a change in
Definitely.
attitude and in perspective?
I travel all the time. If I go to Indonesia, India, Africa, I was in Nairobi. I think people are seeing it. People are seeing it, and I believe many energy industry players are misjudging what is discussed in the streets of the emerging world.
Let's I no longer work for OPEC. Let's put that aside. Let's talk about the clean energy transition.
Okay.
Peak oil is coming. We can relax. 2030, we're going to be rescued, or we'll 1.5 degrees we'll achieve. In short term. Is this a time to be complacent in the energy transition? What would you say to us as we begin this?
Not at all.
Forum?
Peak oil doesn't mean that it will decline the next day. It is you reach a peak, and it declines very slowly. So, with the current policies, current regime, as you call it, despite the peak, we see a temperature increase about 2.4 degrees Celsius, still much higher than 1.5. If we want to reach 1.5, we need deliberate policies to push renewables, energy efficiency, electric cars, and reduce the use of fossil fuels, starting with coal, but others as well. We will still, even in a net zero world, we will still use oil, gas, but much less than what we are using today.
You have been, as we discussed earlier, you have had a very busy week. You've been at very many high-level meetings on the energy transition, on climate. Yesterday, you were at the Climate Ambition Summit. Maybe you could give us some takeaways, and you clearly have your finger on the pulse of attitudes, and we were just talking about the COP20. I know Dr. Sultan was there. We were talking about COP28. What are some takeaways from that, and hopefully what makes you hopeful rather than concerned about some of those discussions, now that we all seem to be on the same page?
Okay. So there are many things, but I mention you one thing which makes me hopeful, and the second thing, what is my main concern. What makes me hopeful is that the clean energy is emerging around the world. It is unstoppable. And it is not, again, in many cases, it is not driven by the climate concerns. They are becoming cheaper. People want to produce energy at home, and they are cleaner. So this is happening around the world. Even if you don't, many countries spoke, they give their examples from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, from North America. It is going around the world. So this is unstable. This makes me happy. Of course, the pace is not as strong as I would like to see, and hopefully it will come true. This is the good news and hopeful news. But what concerns me is the following. So there are different routes to reach 1.5. Some of them use more solar, some of them less solar, more wind. Some use nuclear power, some use this. There are different routes to go to 1.5. But there is no route to go to 1.5 without an effective and fair international collaboration. This is today the Achilles heel of our fight against climate change. Lack of international collaboration. If it doesn't work out, then in the absence of effective and fair international cooperation, it will be much more costly, and we will see a delay of decades to come. So this is the main issue. If you remember, some of us may remember the 2015 Paris Agreement. And the backbone of that agreement was just sometime before the Paris meetings, President Obama at that time had an agreement with the Chinese President Xi, and it provided the backbone of the Paris Agreement. And I very much hope that, I know the geopolitical tensions and difficulties between the United States and China now, but in the interest of this planet, in the interest of the next generations, and even this generation, I think there may be a merit that the US and China may focus on this climate change and go with a common agenda to cope in order to get an agreement. In the absence of an effective international collaboration, our chances, despite what is happening in the clean energy domain, is rather limited. This is my concern.
So that is all of our concerns, and my concern in particular at foreign policy. And we could go on for another half an hour, but you're out of time, and your team is ready to give you the hook. But what I will say is that what you just described from the World Energy Report, wonderful things, solar increases, increased EV car sales, but China's economic decline, these are not, they're intentional, but they're also not coordinated. They're just happening. So it is a concern. So we should have talked about the concern first and then the hope of the youth, to leave us with that. But Dr. Burrell, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Wonderful to hear your firsthand accounts of what's going on. I'd now, that was fantastic, Dr. Burrell joining us. I really appreciated that. I'd now like to welcome Ambassador Majid Al-Suwaidi, the Director General of COP28. We were just talking about COP28, and I'm so pleased that you're here, Ambassador, and we can talk about that in a lot more detail. Welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to see you, please. Another very busy man with lots of meetings all over town. We'll love to hear about that as well. So, but there's another meeting coming up in a couple of months, COP. I would love, and I know your team, which we've spoken with, is furiously working on this. There's a lot of expectations built at this stage. So I would love to hear what you hope to achieve out of COP. If we could just, if you wanted to put a number on it, 2 or 4 agenda items that you hope to hit, just to level set us all, what we're expecting.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me.
Pleasure.
And it's great to have a team who are furiously working, because then I can sit back and relax and enjoy the conversations like this one. We've spent the year going around talking to anybody and everybody who will meet with us, and we've been very fortunate to talk to all sorts of different constituencies and groups, and we've boiled. I hate to say you could boiling climate change down, but because it's such a complicated issue, and it's probably the wrong use of words, right? But for us, success is really about energy and the energy transition. How do we fast track that? How do we decarbonize the energy system we have today? Because it's the energy system we have today. And how do we transition to the new energy system of the future that we want to get to? And how do we make the narrative about what we're giving people rather than what we're taking away? How are we rapidly scaling up the deployment of renewables, hydrogen, energy efficiency, all of those great things that give people a choice to move to the clean energy that we need to get to? Because we need to address that 43% emissions gap, 22 gigatons of carbon that will get us back on track for 1.5. And then, secondly, how do we fix finance? Everywhere we've gone, everybody has said to us the big challenge is finance, and how do we make a difference in delivering on the 100 billion? So the promises that have been made in the past need to happen. But then how do we move from hundreds of billions to trillions of dollars? How do we mobilize private capital? How do we seek reform of the international financial institutions, multilateral development banks, and get finance on the ground to projects and to real people on the ground? And that brings us to the third point, which we believe is about people, lives, and livelihoods. How do we make COPs relevant to the average woman, young person, man, child, indigenous person on the ground, making a difference in their lives? And we've been really focused on that. That's about health, water, food systems reform, education capacity building. It's about all of the things that make it real for people on the ground, and how do we do that effectively and quickly? It's the adaptation story, the loss and damage story. And then the last pillar for us, which is always at the top of our minds, is we can't do this if we don't have an inclusive discussion, an inclusive process that brings everybody together, academics, scientists, young people, indigenous people, governments, CEOs, industrials, have these conversations, bring everybody together with solutions and ideas that will allow us to bridge the gap to what is our fundamental goal, which is that 1.5 degrees that we need to achieve.
Right. So those are 4 small kinds of checklist items that you're trying to hit off on. Kudos to you on taking that on. And to stick with the the poor metaphor, you're in the hot seat right now for trying to pull all that together. We just heard Dr. Burrell talk about the thing that he's most concerned about is global cooperation and geopolitics getting in the way of this cooperation. Yeah. And maybe we could, rather than just focus on all of it, let's just focus on finance and the $100 billion. We're talking about the loss and damage fund.
Yeah.
That's the key that was promised at COP27 in Egypt, and that we're supposed to be delivering on and measuring coming into the new COP. Where are you on that? And what do you think is realistic to achieve when it comes to that, specifically that loss and damage element? That seems to be what Dr. Sultan, the head of a COP, your boss, has been focused on when we speak with him, and you as well. Where are we there?
Yeah, I think that we're making progress. I want to clarify something. We understand the role that the presidency has, and we approach it really humbly. We are in the hot seat. We understand that. But it's a party-driven process, and we say this often. A lot of people say, there's a negotiations process that is happening, and on the loss and damage fund, our role is to get the parties to come together. It was agreed at Sharm el-Sheikh. We need to operationalize it. We need to get it done. There is progress happening in the negotiations. I think the last meeting of the transitional committee who are working on this was fantastic. They made some progress, but it's not fast enough. We need that to happen faster. We need to address many of the challenges that are around it. But loss and damage is one piece of the finance. And it's a critical piece because it's about vulnerable communities. It's about communities that are in situations that were not created by them, but that they suffer the most from. And so this process has to serve them first. But we also need to have a much larger conversation about finance. We often like to think about those number values that are going to make a difference. But what we've been saying is that it's pointless to talk about big numbers without understanding what are the barriers that are preventing finance from getting to the ground. How are we looking at the financial architecture today and how it's mobilizing capital in meaningful ways on the ground? That's about currency risk. That's about perceived risk, credit rating risk. It's about making sure that capital is getting to the developing and emerging markets where growth is happening at scale, and it just isn't today. It's reform of the international financial institutions, it's reform of the multilateral development banks, it's dealing with debt and the debt problem we have. And these are complex issues, and as you said, we're in a world where money is tight, and developed countries are not stepping up. The $100 billion was promised a long time ago and hasn't been delivered. We've had a lot of progress on it, but we need to see more of that because we need that concessional finance to leverage the private sector finance and mobilize it at scale and in a big way so that we address the mitigation issues that we need to and the adaptation issues that we need to as well.
Great. So we also heard, thank you for that. We also heard Dr. Burrell talk a little bit about, I played OPEC. I don't know if you listened to any of that. I don't know if I did a very good job. And we talked a little bit about what's happening with oil prices currently. And that brings me to the topic of Dr. Sultan. And I know there's been a lot of criticism of him, an incredibly unique position. We're in a holding COP in an oil-producing nation. He's the head of one of the largest fossil fuel companies on the planet. He also, of course, founded Masdar, which is an incredible renewable energy company. But you're a former ADNOC geologist as well, correct? So what do you say to those that believe those roles together are a conflict of interest? And how are you going to address that at COP?
Well, I'm so glad you asked this question because I don't get asked this question a lot because maybe people are too polite. And so it's totally fair. And I myself, a lot of people point out that I was a geologist in the oil and gas, but for most of my career, I've been a diplomat and worked on climate change issues. And the fact of the matter is our country was built off of oil and gas. Most people, young people, well, people of my generation, young people not, worked in the industry somehow, so it's impossible for us to not been touched by this industry. But we're fortunate that today our economy is 70% non-oil and gas. That wasn't the case when I went into my career. The oil and gas was what we did, and thanks to great leadership and visionary leadership, we've transformed our economy, and that's in part because of the work that Dr. Sultan Al Jaber has done. A lot of people say, oh, he's the CEO of ADNOC. Oh, and he happened to be the CEO of Masdar at one point in time. Actually, it's the other way around. He was the chairman of Masdar. He's the chairman of Masdar, and he founded that company at a time when everybody criticized us, by the way, for saying, why would an oil and gas country want to start a renewable energy company? Everybody criticized us. Our leadership set him to that task. 20 years on, we have 3 of the largest, lowest cost solar in the world in a country that produces fossil fuels at 1.5 cents per kilowatt hours. When he started, it was 20 cents, 25 cents per kilowatt hour, and he has been instrumental in driving down that cost. And when he was made CEO of ADNOC, he was given a mandate to transform the company, to decarbonize the company, and to think about the future, to prepare this company for the future. And this is a microcosm of what many of us are dealing with. There have been plenty of COP presidents before, and I won't name any, who came from fossil fuel countries. Plenty. And even in very recent times. We are all part of this energy system. And we are transforming it. And our country has said we want to be part of that energy system future. We are committed to it. We are the largest investor in it globally. We're running towards it. And that's something that I think we should be celebrating. And I think that it's exciting that now that people like us are engaged and leading, in fact, on this discussion. And Dr. Sultan, because of the nature of his experience in business, as he went to 14 COPs. He's been twice our special envoy for climate change. He knows the process, the negotiations, the politics, and he's a CEO. I think it's exciting that we have a COP president for the first time who's a CEO. We've always had politicians. So I think that this is really fantastic for the process. We're bringing people together. We're creating an inclusive process. And we're talking in a practical way about how do we have honest conversations about that just transition? How do we create new jobs for people? How do we create new opportunities for young people? How do we transform our economies to be about that clean energy future that we all want to have? And I think that that's really exciting.
So because I am polite, I'm going to applaud to that because I think that was a really good answer to that question. Tough question. Back to Dr. Sultan, who I've met, incredibly driven guy, doesn't seem to really sleep that much.
Tell me about it.
And on a plane around the world talking to everyone and knew what he was walking into with this and how he would be labeled and taking it on the chin, which is pretty impressive. So excited to see what happens at COP. I'm just kind of curious. This must have been a tremendous and is a tremendous lift for you and the COP committee. I'm not casting aspersions on previous COPs, the most previous COP or what have you. They can be nutso. How confident are you that this is going to be a smoothly run operation? That it's going to, what's keeping you up right now as you plan this event?
That's a great question. I've been involved in every aspect of this project, and I have to say I've been surprised. From making sure we have vegan food, making sure we have comfortable places for negotiators, making sure that we've got good Wi-Fi, because let's admit, and trust me, we are confident that this is going to be great. We are working on things like accommodation, simple things, making sure that I talked about that 4th pillar, about making sure that this is the most inclusive COP ever. Inclusion means people are able to come and participate and attend. And our projections are that this is going to be one of the most well-attended COPs ever. We're reusing the expo site. We are putting the blue zone and the green zone slap bang next to each other, so you can step out of one and into the other.
That's
in
good.
fact, we challenged the UNFCCC. I challenged the UNFCCC, why do we have zones? And I almost got tackled by the security folks. If we could have got rid of the security barriers, we would have, but they wanted to make sure, because we have to remember one thing. COPs are an intergovernmental negotiation. And they follow UNFCCC processes and rules, and many of us are here for the UNGA, and that's a long-standing process. We need to respect that. We need to encourage it. We need to create the opportunity for those negotiators to deliver a great outcome. But then let's celebrate all the wealth of action and energy that's going on, and the Green Zone is going to be super vibrant and active, and I welcome all of you to come and join that. But I want to remind you about why COP28 is going to be the greatest COP. Not just because logistically we know we're going to do a great job. We're using the old expo site because we're providing vegan food and cheap accommodation. But it's going to be great because we have the global stocktake. Because that's an assessment of where we are from Paris, and and we know we're off track from 1.5, and that means we are 7 years away from 2030. 7 years to get back on track. And you know that any major policy or project or plan or investment that will make a difference usually takes 3 to 5 years to really work. That means that we have to make those decisions today, or else we're not making 1.5. And we all celebrate Paris. I was there. I was cheering at the end when we delivered this really monumental outcome. But we can't say that it's successful if it doesn't achieve the goals that it set out. And we know we're off track to do that. And COP28 will be the place where we get back on track, we make it practical, we make it work for people, and we bring hope back to the process. Remember what I said, we need to get people energized and excited and feel invested. We need to talk about what we're giving people rather than what we're taking away. And there's young people there who are super excited to be part of this, and we need to give them the chance to do so.
Wow, sounds like Dr. Sultan brought the right guy to the table here. Good for you. So one point I want to bring back, you mentioned vegan food a few times. We had the food minister and minister of many other things, climate of the UAE, Minister Miriam Almiri here yesterday, and she claimed that she's actually helping to review the menu at COP to make sure. Is that accurate?
Well, I was given, I came across this task and I said, who better to do this than our minister? And she's wonderful. She's been engaged with that. You know, we laugh at these things, but we want to walk the talk. We want, when people come to COP28, that they see all of the things that we talk about on the ground happening. And I think that that's one of the great things about the UAE. People often view it from an outside view, but when they come and see that we're doing things on the ground in reality, that is happening, it changes their mind. And so we take that very seriously. Her Excellency Mariam has been very engaged in this topic. We've invested a lot in this. We've been doing these things. And when you come to COP28, you'll see it on the ground. And I feel good about that.
Fantastic. Well, you've set very low and reasonable expectations for us, so there's really nothing hiding there. But we're very excited about what COP28 and what could be achieved. Thank you for putting in the legwork and the prep work, and we know it's going to be a great success. It has to be.
It has to be. Thank you so much for inviting me. And what I would say is please keep working between now and COP, because we often think of COPs as events, but it's a process. And there's I think 69 days today to COP28. And that means all of us have to work between now and COP to bring everything together so that we deliver it at COP rather than waiting for COP to do.
We're all working with you. Thank you so much,
you so
Ambassador.
Thank you.
Next up, Richard Morgan, Anglo-American Head of Government Relations, and Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt, U.S. State Department Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Energy Resources, join veteran journalist Maggie Lake for a conversation on critical minerals and the Sustainable Development Goals.
Fill in from this side. Hello, everyone. Well, I feel energized, and I'm glad the issue of time. 7 years. Wow, we have a lot to do. We have a lot of work to do. But excited to have this conversation because this next topic is absolutely critical to getting there, which is why it's called critical minerals and how they fit into the SDGs. And we're super excited. Just one note, Vera, who is also going to join us, had to bow out at the last minute for a family emergency, hence the empty chair. But I'm sure she's going to be working hard as well. So would love to kick things off, Ambassador. And critical minerals, very interesting topic. There is a lot of intersection, as we know. But this in particular, we know it's a national security issue. We know it is a vital economic issue and also key to sustainability. How are you thinking about that intersection, and how have the discussions been all week?
Yeah, thanks, Maggie, and thanks for the opportunity to share some reflections on this. say a couple of things. First of all, what's really striking to me this year, both during UNGA High-Level Week and around Climate Week, is the central role that this conversation about critical minerals is now playing. To give you an example, the other day I was able to join President Biden for his meeting with the 5 Central Asian presidents. We were talking about critical minerals. This has become a front-of-mind issue in terms of both the pace of the energy transition, but also how we build international partnerships. And what I would also like to put a spotlight on to start with is what we're doing at the State Department. And I think if you look at Secretary of State Blinken's remarks last week at Johns Hopkins, where he tried to frame a foreign policy for the next era that comes after the post-Cold War era, you see both a central focus there on these global challenges like climate, like economic justice, but also the priority the Biden administration has placed on building international partnerships. So when we look at this scarcity of resources, and Richard can talk much better about where the demand curves are leading, but lithium, 42 times increase in demand, graphite, 25 times increase in demand. We're trying to build international partnerships that attack that challenge, but do so in a way that meets high ESGs and creates opportunities for our partners around the world.
Yeah, Richard, I think this is an instance where people are trying to build this in earlier in the conversation instead of having to sort of go back and fix it afterwards. But the demand is enormous. What are you seeing? What are you hearing from customers? And how are you coming to terms with that demand and trying to meet that demand?
Yeah, I think hearing is the right word at this stage, because it is in everyone's lips, critical minerals, but it tends to mean different things to different people. What I've been hearing this week is that from the African countries, we've got a big operating base in Southern Africa on various things, platinum, diamonds, iron ore. We're looking for copper at the moment in Zambia. So we're very much interested in trying to transition to the new minerals ourselves, copper being probably the prime, copper and nickel, probably being the primary ones we'd look at as a big mining company. And African governments clearly want value to be added there. That's not new, but it's a question as to what the just energy transition means and is it credible to them. So you have to respect that. The current operating model tends to be, for copper anyway, certainly for us, is that we don't actually beneficiate it completely in situ. It gets shipped out. That's a bad carbon footprint, if you like. It'll go to Asia, come back as copper. If that's going to change, then we have to work out how. Processing needs power. These things take time. We've just secured an exploration license in Zambia. Then we'll have that for 7 years. We'll drill it actively for 2 or 3 years. We've done agreements with the local traditional leaders there, so everything is in place, but everything like that takes time. We've just brought on a copper mine in Peru. The social license for water there took best part of 10 years to negotiate, to do it properly, do these things properly. So when people say there's huge demand, there probably is, but to bring, and you know, we're a reasonably big company, to bring on stream a mine costs billions. The sort of financing you often hear about is incentives in the millions. It's how do you balance all that out? And if you can meet the high ESG performance standards, which you can, but it often does take time, where do you get the financing from? Does the financing accommodate less profit than it perhaps used to? And in a way, can you put a premium on that product?
Yeah, this comes up again and again, but it is particularly salient when we're talking about the energy transition. Do we have work to do to talk about the transition? Because you'll hear from people that there's a feeling that it's flipping a switch, right? We want to migrate. We hear from other parts of the private sector, we're going to migrate to all EV by a certain deadline. But then there's the reality of what that takes on the ground. We just heard 2030 is 7 years away itself. And you're talking about bringing one mine on, taking that long. Do we have a timing issue, Ambassador and Richard? Ambassador, please. Give me your thoughts first.
So a couple of thoughts. I mean, first of all, I think the requirement for the transition is now widely understood. And I'm struck as I travel around the world, whether it's in developed countries, Japan, Korea, or in the developing world, Nigeria, India, Pakistan, I hear the same narrative everywhere, which is the climate crisis is real and we have to act at a much faster pace than the market alone would produce to accomplish this transition. And that is exactly what drives the dilemma that Richard pointed to. In terms of how we meet those ESGs, so let me give you an example of what the State Department is doing. We have a thing called the Mineral Security Partnership. It brings together now 14 governments, about 50% of global GDP. And we are all committed, first of all, to de-risking our exposure to a single source of these critical minerals, but also partnering with the countries that have these resource endowments. And I think one of the really interesting things about this energy transition moment that we're in, it's going to mean that when we look a few decades out, the world is going to be trading a lot less crude oil, less coal, a lot more cobalt, lithium, copper, nickel, zinc. And it happens to be the case that a lot of those resources are found in the global south. Those countries, quite understandably, want to ensure that they enjoy some of the benefits of that resource endowment. And we share that perspective. So we're trying to figure out how to move at faster than a market pace to accomplish this expansion of supply, because that is what is going to enable the electrification of transport, the development of large-scale battery storage, the deployment of a whole lot more wind and solar and geothermal. But we have to do it with international partners. And that's, I think for me in this role, one of the exciting things about being Assistant Secretary for Energy Resources right now is I'm exercising this responsibility in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act, which has done so much to give the United States credibility in the global climate conversation and is stimulating such remarkable acceleration of investment and innovation in these areas. But we have to bring along the rest of the world. Last point, my boss, Secretary Blinken, always points out, the United States is maybe 12, 13% of global CO2. We could decarbonize the U.S. economy tomorrow, and it will not solve the climate crisis unless we bring along the rest of the world. So this is the quintessential challenge of global partnership and international cooperation.
And that issue of collaboration and partnership, something both of the speakers in the afternoon session already have both really commented on. And this is the most heavily attended, most attended since 2015. And I think they just said they expect COP to be as well. So I think there is a sense of that. Richard, these are capital intensive projects.
They certainly are. And that's why we just need to get as many people interested as possible. Because if you can hit the ESG targets, which you can with care and proper development attention, then it does really bring sustainable development to countries. If you look at Botswana, was once the poorest, among the poorest countries in Africa, through diamonds, through the relationship with De Beers, has become certainly one of the more middle income countries. Chile with copper. It is developmentally possible to really make a difference in a country through mining. So we need to harness what we've learned from that and then just try and apply it across various fronts. And I think the advantage of the other players in the market, like the US coming in, and if we can interest the EU as well, if they're wanting to do things perhaps more locally, then we can try and do that as well. You can mine really sensitively. We've got a big fertilizer project in the UK in a national park. We're looking at one in Finland in a conservation area. It's entirely possible, and we need to adjust or help people adjust their views of what modern mining looks like.
I think that's really important because this is an issue of supply, but it's an issue of supply chains. And we've never talked about supply chains more than we do right now. Do they have to become shorter? Is that a way to...
I don't know they have to become shorter. I think the more options we have, the better. And then people, as long as you can articulate what the supply chain looks like, talking of diamonds, clearly De Beers have done a lot of work in terms of branding what a natural diamond looks like that's been mined ethically. We're seeing the same in copper, for responsible copper, for steel. And I think if you can make clear various options of supply chains, and then customers can make their own choices. And some of the car companies, some of the IT companies, very keen on ethical supply of their materials.
Absolutely.
We need to articulate that and then just give them options.
Yeah, and this is where, just taking from the tech forum that we talked about this morning, we have the tools now to do this more. Ambassador, this is, for all of the talk of collaboration and the importance of supply chain and being preemptive in building this in, this is happening at a time when there are also forces that are for regionalization, nationalization, or nationalism, and talking about a different world than the one we've been living in, with all of these agreements and trade agreements, instead of turning inward and hoarding the resources. How are you navigating through that from a political perspective?
So I'll make 2 points. One, of course, is that the United States remains among the world's most open economies. And we sometimes forget that in the conversation, but in terms of openness to foreign investment, trade as a component of our GDP, we have a very, very open economy, and we have a huge stake in maintaining that openness because that's part of what drives prosperity here at home. Again, I think as I look to the energy transition, if you look back, the past 100 years of the fossil fuel era, it's really American companies that led the way. The Standard Oils and the Exxons and the Essos of the world. I want to make sure that as we come into this energy transition era, it's also American companies that are still setting the highest standards in terms of both ESGs, but also efficiency, recycling, which we haven't talked about, but it sort of feeds into Richard's point about traceability, and it's a key part of this new cycle. A lot of that is already happening. You look at how much innovation is happening in the United States in terms of new battery chemistries, in terms of concentrated solar, and it's the market is responding, and then the United States is taking advantage of the openness and what New York represents, an entrepreneurial system that's arguably the most vibrant and most effective at applying capital to opportunity, the most effective that the international system has. So we need to take that, and we don't want to lose that, even as we try to force the pace of this energy transition, because we're driving the energy transition both as an opportunity for innovation and job creation and the competitiveness of our own economy, but also to meet the challenge of the climate crisis, and which is something to which the United States is vulnerable, but also a phenomenon to which many of our international partners are even more vulnerable. And again, I'm thinking especially of the global south and the dislocations that are already happening in terms of food security, in terms of extreme weather events. So we have a huge stake in meeting the challenge of this moment, and I know that's something that our hosts at COP and the UAE are extremely focused on, in part because that's what they hear from so many of their regional partners.
Richard, what do you think needs to be done to bring more private-public partnership or private-public sort of intermediaries that live in the world of finance, especially when it comes to ESG type of finance? And what's the conversation with mining? Because, for a while, I think mining was really not included in a lot of that innovation that was happening in terms of green finance.
That's exactly right. And I was in Zambia, in fact, last week, and we had an impact investing conference there, which is really about encouraging the entrepreneurial culture the ambassador was talking about in a way that's not necessarily dependent on the mine itself, and we've committed to providing 5 jobs off the mine for every job on the mine because of the advances in technology, which is helpful, but you've still got to provide that wider economic benefit. So and then you have to think a bit more regionally this is in the countries you're producing, because traditionally, certainly in poor countries, you created a mine and everyone flooded in looking for work. That's less the case now. So you need to work with the new reality and provide some kind of economic uplift that isn't necessarily a job on the mine. So it's rethinking ourselves a bit about a new social compact that makes sense for the countries as well sustainably. But you need to talk that through. We can't dictate that. So you have to hear what makes sense for them, and then also work with clients who are prepared to fund that or pay for that extra premium. At the moment, you can get a preference for being a responsible supplier. You don't necessarily get a premium, certainly for something like copper, which has an international price. So it's really getting people behind the idea of differentiation.
You said something really interesting, because we all talk about this race to secure these minerals that are so needed, but you sort of talked about the demand as if it's in the future.
The demand is now, but
the products, are the markets mature enough to be able to sustain the profitability? This is what your investors look at.
If you've ever owned Anglo-American shares, which they go up and down quite a lot, and they go up and down on things that you don't necessarily anticipate.
Yeah.
People suddenly think, oh, China's not needing so much copper, and the price goes down 5%. So no, the market isn't entirely reading it, and the copper price isn't. It's high, but it's not particularly high at the moment. It's not as high as you'd expect for something that's in as much demand as people say it is. The mine we brought on stream in Peru, Quellaveco, is 300,000 or 400,000 tons of copper a year. By any projections, the world needs one of those globally every year, and that's simply not happening. So yes, you'd think the market forces would be good, but mining isn't necessarily a very attractive investment. It's not a massive rate of return, but therefore we need to articulate that better so people think, actually, this is a responsible investment to make.
Yeah.
If we can do that, then I think we start to perhaps get a better, more logical go. Because what happens with us, we're under commercial pressure as well. So suddenly we think we've got the solutions to these things, and then the market goes down and people say, but we can't afford to be doing this.
Yeah.
And that it's a strategic investment.
Yes.
It's not just a commercially attractive transaction, it's a strategically significant transaction.
And that's another word that crops up. People are talking about strategic minerals as well as critical minerals, and we need to work out the timescales, you need to be looking 10, 15 years.
Yeah, and that's, so last word, Ambassador, what do you think can be done to, I think, shed light on some of the nuances in this conversation, as well as foster the kind of public-private partnership that's going to move this along in the equitable way that we need it to happen?
I think the most important thing for us in the United States, and our energy transition is happening. You can see it on our streets and in our houses. The most important challenge I think we face is how we build these partnerships, especially with the Global South, how we de-risk our collective exposure to a single source of so many of these strategic minerals, and especially the processing of those minerals, and then how we create what Secretary Blinken describes as a better offer, how we offer a package of financing, ESGs, local community engagement, which says to countries that have these resources that you don't have only one choice in terms of your international partnerships. And I remember exactly a year ago here in New York, where Secretary Blinken launched the Mineral Security Partnership in our first big ministerial level meeting. And one of the African ministers came up to me on the margins and she said, you know, Ambassador, what I really appreciate is just the fact that the Americans are talking to us about this. Yeah. And I think nobody says that to me anymore, because we've got every embassy in the world is out working on these issues every single day. And everybody understands that this is a strategic race. It's not just a matter of the energy transition. It's about American competitiveness. It's about American leadership. And it's about how we uphold the values that are fundamental to American national security.
It's fantastic. Well, I think we're all happy to hear it's top of mind for everyone. We're going to dig more into the important financing part of this conversation a little bit later, but thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Fantastic stuff.
Thank you.
You can go out that way.
Next up, please welcome to the stage Dan Dorner, head of the Strategic Initiatives Office at the International Energy Agency, Demetrius Papathanassiou, the Global Director of the World Bank's Energy and Extractives Practice, and Omar Vargas, General Motors Vice President and Head of Global Public Policy. This panel, Fostering Trade and the Energy Transition, will be moderated by FP's Executive Vice President, Alison Carlson.
Hello, everyone. I'm really excited for this conversation. It builds so well upon the conversation that we all just heard. Thank you so much for joining us, both here in the room and those online. I just like to remind everyone to please submit questions. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So if you're here in the room, there are the QR codes on your chairs. If you're online, you can see where the button is, and please submit your questions there. I'd really love to build on, what was just discussed, these investments that are related to not only energy security, but sustainability and the energy transition. It's clear that there's a lot of work to do.
that has, become apparent in the conversations here this week with the SDG stock take, and looking forward to COP and the conversation that we heard before leading up to COP 28. And what we're talking about now, building off the critical minerals conversation, is about value chains and strengthening value chains. And this demand is happening amid volatility in global markets. It's happening against the backdrop of COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, where these value chains have really been under stress and fractured in a number of ways. And when everyone is talking about needing to move faster, invest more, we need to assess, where are we really at? And in light of the demand that we're actually facing, what are the specific risks and how can we strategically address them? Dan, I'd like to start with you. Against this backdrop and in consideration of those factors, the IEA recently released the Energy Technology Perspectives 2023, which I think does a really good job of level setting in the present reality about both the risks and the opportunities in light of this demand. And so if you could share with us, to sort of set the stage for our conversation, what are some of these key risks, but also the opportunities and the big takeaways that you're seeing from the report?
Brilliant, thank you. I'm happy to do so, Alison, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think where we start is the fact that we are still actually in the relatively early phase of a new industrial age, an age of clean energy manufacturing. And as you referred to our Energy Technology Perspectives report, what it really looked to do was map from mining through to manufacturing the state of this transition, this industrial age today, and how we see it evolving in the future. Because we're really looking to build a new multi-trillion-dollar industry. So that's the scale of the opportunity that we're talking about, and the fact that it is still relatively early but evolving at pace. So the economic opportunities are huge, and countries and companies around the world are trying to seize them. And I think one of the points that we made was that really means that every country needs to identify how it wants to seize this opportunity, where its value add is, where its strengths lie, and make sure that it has smart industrial policy, industrial strategy to try and realize those opportunities. But again, bringing it back to the kind of here and now, we have seen the last couple of years in the context of COVID and other things, real tight supply chains, as you mentioned, resulting in cost pressures in a number of these technologies and base materials. But we also see there is currently a relatively high concentration of mining, processing, and manufacturing, so across all of the key stages, in terms of the geographic locations of where a number of these industries are developing. And it's been true in the energy sector throughout the different phases of its history that over-reliance and concentration is a risk. You don't want to be overly reliant on one company, one country, one trade route for something so critical as your energy system. Because if it fails for whatever reason, be it innocent or malign, that has such dire economic and social consequences, you just can't take those risks. So we see that as this age continues to unfold, as these opportunities continue to be there, one of the factors that needs to come in is a greater diversification of these, all of the elements of it, from mining to manufacturing. Now, that doesn't mean that we want to go from one country or one company doing it all to every country or every company trying to do everything. Then we'll lose the economic efficiencies there too. But countries have to think about their skills base, their resources, their existing industrial value add opportunities, and design, as I say, that smart industrial strategy accordingly. Because the manufacturing expansion opportunities are huge, the plans are already huge, and they're very dynamic. And the last point I would say is, as part of this evolution, what we also need to not lose sight of is the continuing value of international trade. We can see both now and going forward, we need to make sure that the trade routes that do remain free and fair, and that we can make sure that this system at the same time remains resilient and robust.
Very well put. There are a few things you mentioned that I'd like to pick up on and turn now, Dimitrios, over to you. You know, Dan, you were mentioning the multi-trillion-dollar investment opportunity. And indeed, and in your role at the World Bank, you know, I am curious how you're looking at both the challenge and the opportunity. And when we're talking about the energy transition, indeed there are financing needs and they are vast. How do you prioritize when you can't produce everywhere, just as you were saying, and you need to prioritize? And how do you do it? The need is grand, but how are you going to mobilize and deploy capital to the most efficient, most strategic places?
Thank you very much, Alison, and it's really good to be here. Thank you for having the World Bank in this event. Just backing up a little bit and to put things into a bit of perspective when it comes to costs and what is actually happening in the metals and the minerals. If one looks at the price, say, of a kilogram of copper in the early 2000s, it's around 60 cents or so. And then if you look at what is happening today and what has happened in the last 2 decades, it is about 800% as much. And prices are becoming volatile, but it definitely has stabilized at a level which is about 500% of what it used to be. And of course, this happened primarily because from 2000 to today, China had massive economic growth. Now, on top of that, what is really changing is that the energy transition requires different technologies for things to happen. So if you look, for instance, at combustion engines, the main thing in a combustion engine, it's just steel. And there's plenty of iron and steel in the world. And then all the value addition is about the manufacturing, the design, the small little things that go with it. But if you look now at electrification, then it's different metals. Copper is a big one. Cobalt is another big one with the current technologies that we have. Nickel is very important. And of course, lithium, because that's what runs batteries. And all of these are metals and minerals that nobody cared about at all 15, 20 years ago. They were all marginal. So this new focus on these new metals and materials and the fact that we had this dislocation of demand in the last couple of decades is creating a lot of uncertainty in markets. It makes it difficult for manufacturing companies to predict what their costs are going to be so that they know what is the cost of the product that they would then need to bring into markets, and makes everything much more difficult and much more uncertain. Now, the opportunity that we see in the World Bank when it comes to looking at all these metals and minerals is twofold. First of all, if you look around the globe at where do we have resources for these metals and minerals, a lot of these resources tend to be, and we haven't really explored in depth, but they do tend to be in Africa, certain places in Asia, and in most of the cases, these are in countries that need to develop. And what we see as an opportunity is that there really is a second chance to use the fact that there's going to be this sustainable demand over the next 3 decades as the world is moving towards net zero. So we know that there's going to be demand for these key metals and minerals. And the question is, how can we really leverage these resources for the poor countries and help them really grow? So we've been working on that for some time now. To give you the most recent example, we made an investment, our private sector arm of the World Bank made an investment for lithium in Argentina. And it is an investment that was really welcomed in Argentina. And of course, Argentina is not the most popular, let's say, country for foreign direct investment in these late few years. But however, this investment went ahead, and it is really good both for Argentina and I think for diversifying supply chains. We have several such opportunities across Africa. We're actually working these days on a strategic approach for how do we help Africa develop on the back of these opportunities. And the bigger question, of course, is how do we do this right? How do we do it in a way that respects the environment, takes care of social issues, and helps governance get better? And this is where we really have the opportunity to shift things by working internationally and by, I think, bringing closer cooperation between the emerging demand poles of manufacturing. A lot of that is in OECD countries, in various OECD countries, and the opportunities that we have in Africa. So this is a lot of the work that we're trying to do. We have some clear ideas about how we can do that. We have been working as an institution in the mining sector for a long time, focusing on how do we help countries develop the laws and the regulation that can attract private sector investment. What we really need to be doing much more now, because there is this dislocation of demand, is figure out how can we help to build institutions in these countries that they can then be able to have conversations with investors, be responsive, and move faster. And I think this is one of the big challenges that we're facing and that we need to be doing much more on.
Very well put. And what you're speaking to also speaks to the timelines. Building institutions takes time, as does investing in manufacturing capacity, mining capacity, all of which is very much needed. But also, in the interim, what can be done to address the volatility and to adapt and to meet the demand that we have? And your example of the automobile is particularly relevant in this conversation and the panel. And Omar, I'd like to turn to you.
I know, I thought that was just from me.
And so that sets you up perfectly. From your perspective and GM's perspective, how are you thinking about this as there is increasing demand in the very near term for these range of minerals and metals, and also picking up on your comment about regionalization and diversification of supply chains? How are you thinking about that strategically in the moment?
Sure. And first off, thank you for having us here and participating in this panel discussion. I think FP is a fantastic platform for discussing the issues of the day, and looking forward to the conversation we're going to have for the next little bit here. A couple of reactions and to my co-panelist comments here in response to your question. So, first at General Motors, we are in a really incredible period and have been for some time now as part of our transition, our portfolio transformation over the next decade and in a couple of years from ICE motor vehicles to the electric vehicle. And there is an enormous amount of work being done. I have a great deal of confidence in how capital flows. Capital is going to flow where it's needed, where it's wanted, and where it will increase in value. What I worry about in the context of our transformation, I think it's the points that were made a few moments ago, it's will the policy environment be supportive? Will governments be supportive? Will countries be ready for this transformation that is occurring and now giving rise to a demand in minerals and other materials and workforces and geographies that have so far not been a priority in terms of the global trade environment. You mentioned Argentina. I think Argentina is a good example of a country that sits at a pinnacle of opportunity and a great deal of capital investment opportunity, but doesn't have the policy environment to assure investors that they can get their dollars out. What confidence does an investor have in being able to grow their business and therefore have a secured and sustainable and scalable supply chain? Because that is where supply chains are evolving to, or have been, frankly, I think. I think what we've learned, and to your point earlier, right, what we've learned since 2019, 2020 period in supply chains is that we cannot leave those supply chains vulnerable to pandemics and natural disasters and geopolitical risk. And so that evolution of supply chains has accelerated. There is redundancy built in, there's resiliency built in, that is capital intensive. It takes a lot of creative new planning. Policies need to support that. We have in the news today, concerns about migration flows across the Texas border with Mexico. For Mexico to really take advantage of the potential for nearshoring to supply the North American manufacturing renaissance that is occurring today, sure, there's a tax environment, there's maybe a security environment, there's a workforce environment, but what are we doing bilaterally at the federal and state levels to ensure that the products made in Mexico can come across the border? Because commerce still needs to flow. So these are some of the complications that we see now in our supply chain system that really need some additional thought through on them. And so if I were a policymaker or participant in the process, then I think it'll be critically important to think about the macro issues and then some really creative thinking about the micro issues. It could be migration, it could be workforce, it could be a variety of sustainable and governance issues. And those are the things that I think we need to be thinking about more creatively. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to build on what you just said with another question or two, and we have a question from the audience as well. Thinking about how to be able to invest and assure investors you can, get your money out, and also building the relationships, the bilateral relationships and multilateral relationships that are necessary. Thinking about governance and partnerships and how that really translates, and how historically in many countries there's been resource extraction without the value-add investment at a local level that has resulted in some of the clustering that we see now. And in some cases now, some countries talking about export restrictions if there isn't that kind of value-add investment locally. And so I'm wondering how you all are thinking about that. And Demetrios, to you or Dan, when you're thinking about investments and partnerships with governments, and also ensuring that there is value add that will contribute to economic development, but also the flexibility, as you were noting, Omar, and access to markets and ability for product and value-added inputs to flow across borders. How are you engaging in those kinds of conversations so there is kind of meaningful change in the investment, but also strengthening of the cross-border supply chains?
Yeah, so just a couple of observations from our side. I think, if you go back to the time of the Paris Agreement in 2015, global energy investment was about $2 trillion, and it was split $1 trillion fossil fuels, $1 trillion clean energy. And if you kind of fast forward to today, that $2 trillion has now become $2.7 trillion. And it's still $1 trillion in fossil fuels, but now it's $1.7 trillion in clean energy. And by 2030, it needs to grow to $4 trillion to get us on track with a 1.5 degree pathway. The concern is all of the growth in the clean energy investment over that period is in the advanced economies in China. So across the developed economies as a whole, over that period, the investment in clean energy investment has basically been flat, which very much speaks to a lot of the concerns about the investment environment, the enabling environment, the willingness of capital to flow into those places. And that's absolutely something that we need to see change, and that there is obviously a lot of work going on around the world to try and make that happen. And we do a lot of work, including just recently putting Clean Energy Finance in Africa report together with the African Development Bank, and really trying to identify how, including colleagues at the World Bank, can try and put their resources to the best possible use in terms of then leveraging the private sector capital that needs to come in, because public capital will not be anywhere near enough on its own. It needs to be leveraging in at a scale of factors on top, the private capital to come in behind it. It's one of the prescient challenges that policymakers are wrestling with right now.
Demetrios, did you have additional thoughts on that from a financing perspective?
So, again, just trying to put things into some perspective, and Dan is right that the world will need to very significantly ramp up capital investments in clean energy by 2030 to about $1 trillion for the countries that we work in. That's not OECD countries. And indeed, if you look at the global, everyone, then we're talking about $4 trillion. Now, it's important to bear in mind that the world today spends, and for sure for last year where fossil fuel prices were quite elevated, the world is spending every year about 10 trillion on fossil fuels. So when you think about this recurrent spending, then actually, 4 trillion of investment is not such a big deal. Because we are spending every year more than 10 trillion. We did more detailed calculations on the power sector in the countries where we work in, and we left China out because China is such a massive market. And we saw that even the countries where we work in, which is low-income countries, middle-income countries, they still spend on fossil fuels, which is mostly coal, a big chunk of it is coal, and a significant part of the rest is gas. They're spending $500 billion every year, year after year, on fossil fuels. So raising $1 trillion or $2 trillion, actually, from a pure financial perspective, is not difficult to the extent that we managed to turn the spending on fuels into spending financial costs of equity returns and debt returns. Now, you did mention earlier, and I think you're absolutely right, that in the short term, right now, the world is in a difficult position because interest rates have gone up. We have the war in Ukraine that adds additional uncertainties in terms of the prices of commodities and the global outlook for energy and therefore economic growth. But I think it's important to look beyond that short-term problem that we have. And what is beyond that is that if we manage to shift the energy system towards renewables, then what we really do is we manage to have different levels of jobs. We have much less local pollution. A lot of people focus about climate change and the fact that indeed the planet is warming. But there are amazing benefits, especially in the countries where we work, where pollution at the local level is really bad and it is killing people at high numbers. And, we're not even putting that in the equation of when we're thinking about what is it that we should be doing. So I think that the argument of why we should move towards clean energy, despite everything, is very clear. Now, getting it done, it's also possible because, and we looked in the bank, we issued a report just a few months ago called Scaling Up to Phase Down. And we outline how we think this can work, how it has been working in countries, and what are the lessons that we got from it. And what we see is that this is actually possible. It requires a consistent approach. And the fact, as Dan mentioned, that you see renewable energy investments picking up globally and breaking record after record is really good news. And the best news of all is that we know that if this is sustained, and already we're beginning to see, for instance, in solar panels, that we are getting back into a trajectory of costs going down for material. Solar panels already, they had a hump in the last couple of years, but now we see again good signs that those prices are coming down. We have a long way to go on batteries. Batteries are at the moment a critical and difficult part. But I think if we maintain the policies, if the targets about decarbonization are sustained, what this will bring is confidence for investors to go out in some of the more difficult places, that, as we discussed, in Latin America and in Africa, because that is where we have the key materials, the key resources that really are needed for the world's decarbonization. So I think this is a sequence, right? I mean, people need to feel confident that we are indeed serious about net zero. This means that we're going to need new resources. This means that investment needs to go to places that it hasn't been going before.
Yeah.
And from our side, we're ready to support that, absolutely.
And to that end, I think the underpinning point here is being sustained. Sustained commitment in the investment, sustained partnerships, and continuing to be there and to develop the longer-term relationships in the countries where you're operating, where you're engaging in and sourcing some of your inputs. And so over to you, Omar, when you're thinking about those partnerships in where you're operating and where your supply chains are flowing through and, sustainable sourcing, how do you think about that? And understanding that is incredibly important to that supply chain resilience over the longer term.
Yeah. It comes with understanding one's commitments, like our company's commitments, and ensuring that flows down through the supply chain. I think, when you were speaking just now, what came into my mind is that there are auto companies that argue that the electric vehicle is less sustainable than the ICE engine. And it makes me scratch my head. So I just don't get that. But maybe it's because there isn't the right flow down in sustainability and other governance practices. Right? And so companies like General Motors ensure that their principles, our commitments, are flowed down. That's the expectation of our supply chain. And when we think about our supply chain strategy today, and we've created a center of excellence to ensure that we're managing the supply chain transformation that is consistent with our obligations, we think about a sustainable, scalable, and secured supply chain. And I think if companies, manufacturers, other auto companies or manufacturers more generally were to follow those same principles, and I think we achieve the targets and the goals that you were just outlining, which it has to happen in a short time period for this to be successful. And if it isn't, then I think we've got some larger complications to deal with.
Alison, may I make a quick point? And I think we need to also think about new modalities of how we get this done and how we create resilience in the supply chains. One possible way, and we are in discussions with manufacturers, is, and you can imagine an auto company, GM, ideally taking equity in the development of a mine for the material they need somewhere in Africa. And this definitely needs to be backed up by a number of agreements, bilateral. Governments need to support that. But I think this is the way that we should be thinking. How can we do things differently, given the fact that we need to accelerate things, we need to reduce uncertainties for everyone, and we need to get, the demand and the supply closer in a way. And I think these new ways of approaches and these new solutions is what we need to push forward.
Absolutely, and I'm excited that you're talking about innovations and partnerships that need to happen to really underpin that, and that can also set an example of how else other relationships can be modeled. You mentioned trade at the outset as well. This trading ecosystem in more sustainable materials and inputs needs to be achieved, and it's exciting what's ahead, and there's tremendous opportunity, and you're each playing a role, so thank you for your contributions to the work that you're doing, our collective challenge, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And now, please welcome to the stage Dr. Holly Jean Buck, an assistant professor in the University of Buffalo's Department of Environment and Sustainability, and Mario Loyola, a research professor and director of the Environmental Finance and Risk Management Program in the Institute of Environment at Florida International University. This discussion on fossil fuels and clean energy will be moderated by FP's Andrew Solinger.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, trying to fight the post-lunch blues. Good afternoon, everyone. So thanks for staying with us. Some really interesting discussions on the energy transition, and we're going to continue that right now with Mario Loyola and Holly Jean Buck, both brilliant academics. And I've got some bad news for you. We were billing this as a head-to-head debate, and it turns out Mario and Holly agree on a lot of things, unfortunately.
We've resolved everything.
And we solved everything. And what we agree on is that we are in the midst of a vital energy transition. It is something that we are, and we talked about this at the top of this discussion with Dr. Barral and through all of these discussions. It's in our midst right now. The nuance in here, and what we're going to discuss and unpack right now in the next 20 minutes, is the speed of that transition and how we undertake it. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit on how we can, should we and how we can accelerate the discontinuation of fossil fuel usage and exploration and production, and how far we need to go on our net zero process, and if it's the right goal for us to achieve net zero, which in and of itself really clarifies the fact that we're going to have continued use of fossil fuels. It's not zero fossil fuel use and zero carbon, it's net zero. So is that net the appropriate and realistic goalpost for us to hit? So let's get into it and start talking about that. And Mario, I'd love to start with you and hear your take on fossils and why they are vital to the energy transition, not just vital today, but vital to the energy transition. Please.
Yeah, and it's very counterintuitive because people often think that you need to reduce the production of fossil fuels in order to make renewable energy more cost competitive. That's usually where sort of the thinking starts. But as we saw with a lot of this is happening against, fresh in people's minds is still the yellow vest protests in France when President Macron proposed to raise gasoline tax by 50 cents a gallon, and how quickly President Biden ran away from the idea of a carbon tax in the course of 2021 as gasoline prices increased. And the moral of the story is that when gasoline is $2 a gallon, people are willing to listen to prognostications of future climate risk and are maybe willing to make sacrifices about it. But when gasoline is $5 a gallon, they do not want to talk about 100 years from now. They're going to vote you out of office if you don't fix the problem.
And we're at $100 a barrel right now.
And we're headed back there again. And so constricting the supply of oil has the impact of raising, even just a little bit, has the impact of raising prices a lot. And that's very counterproductive to the effort for a clean energy transition because besides the fact that it creates windfall profits for oil companies, which is not the people that you want to be enriching, it's also the fact that it makes people very angry. And when people get very angry and the country of France falls apart for a year, the constraints on what politicians can do becomes very narrow. And so investments that politicians would like to make and might be able to make in clean energy become very narrow. And that's an important factor to contend with.
Very good. Thank you for helping us understand that a bit more. Holly, in your book, Net Zero is Not Enough, you argue that net zero rhetoric might lock the planet into a permanent condition where fossil fuels continue forever, reinterpreted as part of sustainable carbon management. Is net zero a solution or is it a problem? I'm guessing the latter based on that one snippet.
Net zero is a problem if that's your only goal. So I think it's a step forward in the sense that a bunch of nations agreed to the same thing, which is better than where we were at. But the thing about net zero is that there's strategic ambiguity about how much residual emissions you have and how much carbon removal you have. And right now, many of our long-term strategies, including here in the US, are betting on pretty large amounts of carbon removal. Like we're thinking we're going to maintain the land sink and remove 500 million tons through engineered solutions that are presently extremely nascent, and it's not clear if they can scale. So
right.
That's a trap.
So that's a trap. And but the continued belief, just to clarify Mario's point, in the fact that we right now in this transition need fossil fuels is accurate. I am not putting words in your mouth, but in fact, our goal, our end goal that we're moving towards is probably not the right end goal.
Yeah, we need an end goal of phase out, and we need it to be a managed decline and a planned phase out, not a chaotic, unmanaged decline, because neither businesses nor communities want that.
Right. Okay, great. And Mario, maybe we could talk a little bit about if you think that is something that we can achieve and in what time frame. Do we have the infrastructure to support an energy future that is entirely clean?
So the question, to put it in economic terms, is, do we have renewable energy substitutes for fossil energy if gasoline starts to go from $2 a gallon to $3 a gallon, or electricity starts to go up? And what are the obstacles to that? We don't, and there are major obstacles to rolling that out, and there are physical factors that limit how much renewables you can actually deploy on a grid and still maintain a stable grid. And so I'll try to touch on each of those. But the major factor that I see, and it's a major factor in every industrial economy that the European Union is starting to get very involved in, directives on this front, is the red tape that's involved in permitting and environmental impact assessment for these renewable energy projects. And just to give you a sense of what the scale of the problem is here, the Princeton Net Zero, to name one example, the Princeton Net Zero study talks about that we need 500 gigawatts of new solar capacity for a clean energy transition. That's about, back of the envelope, 1,000 utility scale solar projects of 5 to 10,000 acres each. Not all of those things need federal permits, but where the capacity factor is highest in the western states, every one of them needs a federal permit on federal land. And the entire federal government is capable of producing this process. First of all, is so risky to project developers that only people who are willing to lose $25 or $30 million in the hope of making much more exorbitant returns, which is a premium that they pass on to consumers, by the way, right? So the cost of capital is much higher than it would be if it wasn't for all this red tape. That constrains the number of people that are willing, the number of projects that get proposed. But then, even so, the constraints on the federal agencies' ability to permit these projects, the process is so taxing of agency resources that the entire Bureau of Land Management, which manages all of the land in the western states where you would build solar projects, can produce like 3 permits a year. And 1,000 utility scale solar, math is not my forte, but if you need these things to be operational by 2035, they have to have their permits in time to build, right? Which means that they need to get permitted by 2030, 2023 to 2030 to get 600 or 700 permits. When BLM is producing 3 permits a year, we are not on track for success here.
So that's a problem that we'll need to talk about overcoming. Holly, one of the things that you've talked about, and I know you do research on this right now, what the mindset is in some of these regions that are impacted by these projects, and where those, whether or not they're on board and we can enfranchise them in this transition. Just kind of curious your view on how we can accelerate that process where we won't have protests against the transition. One of the quips you made was you would not organize a protest that says #end fossil fuels right now. It's just not realistic, but we do have to bring along the rural populace on this journey with us. What are you finding in your research right now?
Yeah, so, a lot of people support clean energy. They want to go green. That means different things to different people, but they're on board with the idea of energy independence, energy security, but they want to feel like they have choices. They don't want somebody telling them at a national level, this is the way. And they want to see real benefits from these projects on the ground. They don't want to feel like they're just, a stop on the way to somebody else's energy future.
Right. So you're actually a sociologist, not an energy expert per se, although you've brought yourself up to speed quite nicely, it seems, on energy. What's your understanding now of the mindset of these folks and what those incentives are for them? Is it do they want to see cash, or is it really just ultimately understand what the benefit is to them for these projects and their energy infrastructure?
I mean, there's a bunch of ways you could frame benefits. It could be in the form of investment in new infrastructure. It could be tax revenue that goes to that community that they can use for their schools or fire department or whatever. They want quality jobs. They don't want necessarily low-wage solar jobs replacing higher quality industrial jobs. Many places they would like union jobs with prevailing wage and project labor agreements and those kinds of things.
Right, understood. And Maria, where have you seen, let's take this to the global level. You mentioned Gilets jaunes, the protests in France. What countries, regions, what have you seen globally that seems to be working in this regard in terms of permitting reform and trying to make change so we can make this transition more expeditiously? Sure.
Well, so one thing that I have seen is that in the European Union appears to be much more aware of this obstacle to renewable energy permitting than the political class in the United States. We've had a permitting reform in a recent bill back in May in the United States permitting reform effort was defeated as part of the Inflation Reduction Act last year, incidentally, by the Progressive Caucus, which is an issue I want to come back to. But in the European Union has started to hand down directives that require member states to accelerate permitting of renewable energy infrastructure projects. And what that has meant in practice is to actually dramatically reduce the ability of local opposition to block projects. So in the United States, part of the reason why, with the possible exception of Japan, the United States has the world's most cumbersome system of permitting and environmental review for these infrastructure projects. And part of the reason is that the system has evolved to really amplify small pockets of local opposition and often elevate local opposition over national policy priorities. We see this, by the way, even in the current administration, which is supposedly committed to clean energy deployment as a matter of priority. The rate at which the Biden administration is permitting renewable energy capacity is lower today than in the last year of the Trump administration. And that's a really incredible fact to me, because in the Trump administration, I was in the Trump administration. The Trump administration attitude towards renewable energy ranged from agnostic to hostile. But because the administration was focused on accelerating these processes and cutting through red tape, the beneficiary of the permitting reforms that we put in place in the administration, the main beneficiary turned out to be renewable energy projects, which have suffered comparatively under the Biden administration. And so I think this really highlights what I think is, to look at the two sides of the coin, the fossil and renewable energy coin, it's really important that we accelerate the pace at which renewable energy is available as a substitute for fossil energy. That's number one. And number two, there's another thing that I want to highlight, which is the physical limit on how much renewables energy you can deploy on a grid and still maintain a reliable grid. Because the experience of California suggests that that's 30% renewable energy. They've got so much solar power in the middle of the day that they have to do curtailments and pay Arizona to take it off their hands. And they're still on the verge of blackouts at night. And if you go to 50, it's just impossible to go to 50% or 60%. Why? Because solar and wind power during the day is totally unpredictable, whereas demand has a more predictable curve, and you need to have dispatchable sources that you can dial up and down to complete that, to meet that demand throughout the day. Dispatchable sources today means either fossil energy or nuclear energy. Now, that is a very simple and elegant solution, is to just build 200 new nuclear plants. And now you would really get to not just net zero, but actual zero. But there's one thing that Senator Bernie Sanders hates more than the Vietnam War. It's nuclear.
So spicing it up now with Mario, we have some questions. Before we go to those questions from our digital friends and folks who are watching online, please, if you have any questions, raise your hand. We'll try and bring them in. I do want to first, though, come back to you, Holly, for a quick moment. One of the things that you mentioned is our need to move faster, and we need to do that in a way that's more than just trying to cram it through. There's no real agency for adaptation, you were saying. What are some of the things we can do organizationally from a government perspective to try and accelerate the pace of change?
Yeah, so one is we don't really have planning capacity that's multi-scalar. We have these great local towns doing their climate action plans, but they need to be in dialogue with the federal government. They need to understand how to access money from the bipartisan infrastructure law or the Inflation Reduction Act. It's just complicated for a small town or sometimes a tribal nation to access those funds. But on this permitting reform point, too, I mean, we muddle up a bunch of stuff when we talk about permitting reform. Transmission planning is one thing. We have, like 2 terawatts in the interconnection queue. We need to deal with that. That's a manufactured problem that's, because of the way we have set up that system for fossil fuels and not renewable interconnects. And there's some fixable things like that. But the solutions can be actually kind of mundane, like staffing up permitting agencies. It's not a flashy thing to talk about, but that's big part of the solution.
That's a potential solution as well.
Yeah.
I think it's very flashy.
Claire, why don't we hear a question from our folks online?
Thanks very much. Matthew in Washington, D.C. is wondering, How is it? What's the justification behind ongoing subsidies for the fossil fuel industry while we're trying to, incentivize the transition to clean energy? And this could be part of the political conversation you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I think this is a very controversial thing. I think the subsidies that Matthew was talking about are like investment depreciation rules and investment tax credits. Again, let's say that we remove all of these so-called investments, and there's a debate whether they're subsidies. And there's a debate whether that's what they really should be called. But if you remove all of them, what's going to happen? You're going to constrict the supply of oil, and you're going to constrict the supply of fossil fuels, and it's going to raise prices. Now, again, this is a very, in environmental. I teach environmental law. It's a basic principle of environmental law that we want any activity that produces pollution to internalize the externality of the pollution that it's imposing on society. And so when you look at something like fossil fuels and you say, well, this produces carbon or other pollutants, this has a social cost, we want to, whether by some tax or some other mechanism, we want to seek to internalize that cost. The fact remains, however, that however you regulate that, and I mean the social cost of, just look at the Biden administration's effort to put a figure on the social cost of carbon. First of all, it's highly speculative, but second of all, whether it's speculative or not, again, you're running up against the problem that when you impose that tax, you're going to make people very, very angry. And so that's going to
There's a consumer impact.
Yeah, there's a consumer impact, and then I learned a lot. I don't think The Walking Dead is a particularly good show, but I learned a lot from Rick Grimes in The Walking Dead, which is that you can't be ethical if you're dead. And that's what politicians have to think about. You can't be committed to climate action if you just got voted out of office. And so,
by the way, Matthew from Washington, I think, is right behind Claire. So if we added him, do you have a follow-up?
I have a follow-up.
Oh, could you hand Matthew the microphone?
Sure, I have a follow-up. You mentioned that there's no way you could go above 50% renewables. I would challenge you on that. There are a number of systems that are already operating at 100% system. South Australia, for example, Greece has hit 100%. California itself has experienced periods where it's been 100%. The technology is there. Storage, especially systems with hydro storage, can utilize these systems to address variability. I think the idea that renewables can't meet more than 50% is a fallacy, and it should not be fostered.
So I think that I have to disagree with you. First of all, I would like you to try to go sell a community in California on the idea of a pumped storage hydropower project. I would like to see, and I'm happy to pay for your personal security. Okay? I mean, this is really difficult. These things are very difficult to sell. The one country that I know of that has 100% true renewable is Norway, because they have like 3,000 hydropower projects. And hydropower, I put it in the category of dispatchable energy, right? Because it's like more or less constant, or at least predictable, unlike solar and wind, which are hyper variable. The California grid demonstrates, and will demonstrate in spades when they try to implement the electric vehicle mandate, is the enormous problems of trying to manage a grid that has even 30% renewable penetration on it. These are very, very serious problems. They're dangerous blackouts and curtailments in California every other year now, and those are problems that have to be contended with. The battery storage, it's coming along, but battery can flatten that variability out a little bit. It can't take energy on Monday and store it until Wednesday. It can take energy from 2 p.m. and store it until 4 p.m.
Holly, what's your take on that?
We're at the beginning of this transition. It has a long way to go, and I don't think we can extrapolate the final form from just what we've seen at the beginning.
Right. It's going to take a little time to work its way through. One of the things we discussed is international examples. We were talking, I believe I just heard Mario, cite the Nordics. I know you don't like that example because they're so small and rich as they stand right now. Are there any international examples? I fail to turn to you with that you've been able to uncover that you would look towards, of who does it well as a shining light for the U.S.
Well, now can I not talk about the Nordics?
Sure. Don't talk about the Nordics.
Because Denmark has actually done a really good job with offshore wind, bringing in community ownership of some of these facilities, and I think that's the way to do it.
Right. Okay, great. Mario, does Denmark seem like a good example for us to follow as well?
Actually, Denmark is a very good example of something the United States should seriously consider doing, which is consolidating all of its environmental laws into one statute with a single permitting agency and a single permit application. That could actually, I mean, that would solve an enormous problem that we almost haven't talked about, which came up a little bit. The problem of financing, it's going to be at the COP, is the problem of private financing. The renewable transition cannot happen only on the basis of public financing. You have to make these projects show a return on investment and open them up for private financing, and you can't do that as long as the permit application is as risky as it is today. You have to make this process predictable so that you can open it up to private financing.
Thank you, Denmark. An excellent example for us to end and conclude and agree on. Thank you so much for taking that to the folks here. Thank you for your interactions with the audience. Matthew, Mario, Holly.
Thank you very much.
Next, please welcome to the stage Isaiah Oliver, the Deputy Chief of Party for the USAID Climate Finance Development Accelerator Program at Chemonics, Kavita Sinha, Director of the Private Sector Facility at the Green Climate Fund, and Thilan Wijayasinghe, Chairman and CEO of TW Corp Private Limited. This panel, Beyond Bridgetown, Private Sector and the Energy Transition, will be moderated by veteran journalist Maggie Lake.
I've been the chairperson all day, adding chairs and taking them away. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be back again and have this fantastic panel with us. And I feel like we just got handed a beautiful baton segue because I heard them say that it can't be public alone. We need private financing and some predictability. And all three of our fantastic panelists are expert in that topic. And in fact, through all the conversations, when we're talking about accelerating the need for speed and to make change to meet the goals, financing is absolutely critical and key component of that. So let's kick off with you, Isaiah. We were joking, Isaiah wasn't sure he's going to make this because he's been on the road so much, but I think that means you've got your finger on the pulse. So talk to me a little bit about the funding shortfall, because that's the reality, right? We need more money put toward these goals. What do you think the biggest barrier is when it comes to the energy transition for investments? What's standing in the way?
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. So I just came back from Bridgetown, Barbados last week, where I was helping launch an activity managed by our program, the Caribbean Climate Investment Program, and got a good opportunity to connect with some folks on the ground to hear about what are those barriers. I mean, first, I think there's the first one is one that we talk about nonstop, which is that we need new ways to scale the deployment of private capital, and particularly those investors that are currently sitting on the sidelines, whether commercial investors and particularly institutional investors that have the access to those deep pockets of capital that are really going to be needed to take us from billions to trillions, as we're just talking about. But I also think, from being in Barbados, we also have activities or partnerships that are focused in much larger emerging markets like India, South Africa. And it is important to note that ultimately the challenges are really center around de-risking that private investment and figuring out ways to convince those investors to come in. But the specific barriers do vary quite a bit. In the Caribbean context, really what is standing in the way is a lack of pipeline. And even if we can convince some of these larger investors to come in, they're not going to come in.
Pipeline of money as opposed to pipelines in the ground?
Pipeline of projects, sorry.
Pipeline of projects.
Yeah, so
okay.
Projects that are there, that are ready, that have been designed, that have gotten permits. We heard the previous panel talking about permitting in the U.S. And that so investors can look at those projects and say, like, okay, I have faith that this project is going to move forward and get to the point to be constructed and then eventually functioning and providing that renewable energy or transmission capacity or whatever it is that is critical for the energy transition to move forward. And so that's sort of one example of a barrier. But
I think that makes sense. And I think that we heard them touch on predictability, right? I mean, this is the way. There's a format to investing and how it's traditionally done, and they're trying to apply that lens, and in some cases it's not there. Kavita, before we move any further, could you sort of explain the role that you all play in this? Because it's kind of this hybrid middle ground that seems so essential. Can you give us kind of a layman's explanation?
Yeah, well, GCF, the Green Climate Fund, is I would say, the only international financial institute that was set up in the 21st century. We are a very high-risk capital, and we are patient capital, and our only mandate in town is to be ensuring that the developing country have the funds to make mitigation and adaptation to climate easier for them. So that's what we do. And we have the role that I play within that is to enable, using our capital, which is public money, is to enable private sector to invest in developing countries and move from the billions to the trillions. We take risks that others can't take. We stay in the projects for much longer than others. What that we hope allows the private capital, commercial and institutional investors to then reprice how they think of risks in these projects and come in behind us so that they can then together have enough pool of capital to make the investments work where they are needed.
The idea of patient capital, I think, makes sense to many of us, and it exists in the traditional finance world. Yeah. Anytime you're going to market or you're doing a roadshow, you want those big, longer-term investors in that patient capital and that are not going to cut and run when things get tough. So that makes sense to be that. And understandably why this is such an important element of that. Thielen, you are in the private sector now and have your own investment bank, but have decades of experience working in government, advising government, and now on the outside trying to move the needle. What do you identify as the challenges? And we're going to jump to some of the things that are working as well, because I think there is a lot of progress. But what's the challenge? And over that sort of the many years of experience you've had, how has the conversation changed around this?
I think the key challenge is to ensure that a country and a private sector that's seeking international capital, particularly a developing country, has a proper set of rules, regulations, consistency, credibility, stable macroeconomics. And if those elements are there, generally private capital knows how to price risk. For example, in the late 90s, when I was headhunted by the government, we were in a situation where Sri Lanka had war, had a conflict. And we were able to nevertheless raise about $1 billion worth of infrastructure related financing and financially close those. However, fast forwarding many years into the future, we have now a situation where the country has actually declared bankruptcy and we are going through a debt restructuring process. And is now, having had a 20-some-year head start, is struggling to attract capital. So it's important for us to learn back what we have unlearned over the years and build the sort of institutional strength, institutional structures, rules, regulations to attract capital, such as what Kavita was speaking about from the GCF. And I want to make just one more point, and this capital is not just limited to the country itself, because Sri Lanka is one country that has a potential to export energy up to about 50 gigawatts of offshore wind. So therefore, I believe that this capital also needs to look at the regional context, where countries can share power through shared grids within the geographical location that it's situated in.
Yeah, Isaiah, this brings up a point, I think, and Thielen, is it credibility? Is it without any ratings, just the international investors looking at you and looking at Sri Lanka and saying, this is not a bet this is not a place I can put my money? Is it? Yes.
What international investors look for is, certainly they would look for credit enhancements in certain situations, but not in a situation where the off-taker, which is the purchaser of energy, is bankrupt and has defaulted on existing power purchase contracts. Okay. So that needs to be put right now. There are more than one South Asian country, including Sri Lanka, that has defaulted on power purchase contracts. So it will take years to build confidence, but in that interim period, it's important to put the house in order, and that's where intermediaries such as Chemonics and first loss guarantee type financing that's provided by GCF becomes extremely important in pressuring those countries to put the rules, regulations, and frameworks in place so that you can go from an unviable electricity sector to a viable sector. And there's usually a transition period about 3 to 5 years within which we can achieve that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Isaiah, this I think fills in some gaps because we hear and we know that there's all this money on the sideline, right? We've seen the huge investment shifts. Whether it's BlackRock or, moving funds to ESG and earmarking funds to ESG, and then you hear that that money is sitting on the sideline, but they have no projects. Why is that happening, and how do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that we can do to bridge the gap. I mean, to Tilan's point, I mean, I think that private investors can assess risk, and they certainly have established methodologies. But at the same time, some of those investors that are sitting on the sidelines, I mean, we're asking them to look at and consider markets that they maybe have never invested in. And so naturally, they are going to, the perception that they're going to have of risk associated with those investments is frequently not in line with what actual investment performance is on the ground. And so what can we do? I mean, there are lots of different tools. I think from our perspective, our project, we're partnering with USAID, and we're using grant capital as well as technical assistance and looking for where we have the greatest opportunities to be catalytic in bridging that risk gap, to get investors to the point where they do feel comfortable and are willing to go in, and with the hopes that we can then scale back that assistance and then allow the market to work as we, I think, all want it to do.
Yeah, Kavita, really the same issue. What do you see in terms of helping close that? And do investors have an accurate sense of the risk of these projects?
That's a very good question. I think there are two types of risk, right? There's a perceived risk. If you haven't been in that market, then you don't know what the risks are. And if you can't qualify or quantify the risk, the investor doesn't want to go there. So that's the perceived risk. And then there's the real risk. As Dylan mentioned, there's the government, there's the institution. Many of them may not yet be stable. Some are still in formation. So what can capital do in that place? The role that USAID and you play is to enable that policy de-risking, to create that stable environment so that others can price. What institutions such as GCF, what we can do is we provide a de-risking layer of capital. If projects, let's say a private sector project on its merit has good profit-making ability, it's bankable by itself, but it is hampered by the country's risk perception. If the country has either it doesn't have any credit rating or has very poor credit rating, good solid projects underneath it will not be able to bridge that risk perception. So we had, when we understood this in talking to the countries where we work with, we helped create an international institution for guarantees, the Green Guarantee Company, which will be located out of a developed country, and its sole purpose is to credit enhance bonds that the private developers might issue from developing countries to access Western capital, which is oftentimes cheaper and longer duration, but it's not available here where they need it most. And so our guarantee company will issue the guarantee to credit enhance them, which might bridge the gap between the country's guarantee and what a creditworthy financier wants to invest in. So those are some of the examples we're doing. We also do equity investments in ventures in developing countries who might want to bring in technology or scale technologies or create supply chains in local markets that will enable them to foster this longer-term development goals. And we have so far, of the nearly $13 billion that GCF's own capital has gone into, we have mobilized about $50 billion in total, but that's still very little. If you're looking at even just a single transition of energy transition, we need trillions and trillions of dollars every year. And not just in transitioning from fossil to clean, but also meeting the growing demand. Right, and then and those last mile customers. So there's a variety of needs, and we do this in a variety of ways to enable that, from the project preparation to actual financing to equity investments, and prepare sort of really that comes from listening to all the ecosystem partners or where the need is so that we can customize our tools to them.
Which seems like it's an incredibly important component, Dylan. I mean, you're dealing with this, and it's not just the project itself. It's in the context of all the other economic conditions that are happening.
Actually, Maggie, it's in that context that Sri Lanka, about a year ago, is embarking on probably the most ambitious reform process of the power sector undertaken anywhere in South Asia, where despite the fact that we have 100% penetration in electricity, the government has announced an ambitious plan of migrating from about 40% renewable to 70%. And in the next month or two, we'll implement a groundbreaking legislation of unbundling the Central Electricity Board into separate generation, distribution, and transmission companies, of which generation and distribution will be privatized. And the government has built a pipeline of about 3,000 megawatts of renewable energy projects on top of the requirement to decarbonize the coal-fired plant and to privatize some of the generation assets. So Sri Lanka alone, just for its domestic market, can attract several billions of the capital that you spoke about, Kavita. And here, if I was asked, what is your one wish in order to attract that capital? Number one would be technical assistance, to build that capacity within the government and the relevant government institutions. Number two would be access to blended financing. Why? Because a point that was made in the previous discussion, in order to make renewable energy more stable in terms of its ability to provide stability to the grid, you need to look at new technologies. And in Sri Lanka in particular, where we have tapped virtually 100% of the hydro resources, we need to build pump storage because of the vagaries of weather. And then we need to migrate towards battery storage because we have yet to tap a vast potential of solar that we have. And as I mentioned earlier, we have 50 plus gigawatts of wind, of which more than half is in shallow waters offshore. So the point is that if I were to have, as a country, blended finance, technical assistance, and the credit enhancement that you spoke about, we again become a regional powerhouse, actually, not just to generate renewable energy in our country, but to export it to countries such as India.
Yeah, and we're talking about accelerating. It sounds like that's what's needed. I'm interested, all of you seem to be filling not only the capital role, but a role of sort of local expertise and knowledge in some way. Is that lacking in some of the countries because of either the nature or non-existence of capital markets and the financial markets? How important is that, Thilan? And let's go right down the line on that.
I mean, a country such as Sri Lanka with a $90 billion GDP per capita, its financial markets are thin. So in order to look at 15 to 20-year tenor money, it's impossible. And for the banking system, the domestic banking system alone to finance the migration to renewable energy, it's next to impossible. So what tends to get done, it's the smaller projects, the mini hydros, that 5 to 10 megawatts do get financed by local banks, but they don't necessarily produce the economy of scale.
Yeah.
So absolutely, we need to tap into international capital. And then comes the issue of how do you hedge against foreign exchange risk. So I believe just as much as an investment bank, I can say this, a great degree of financial engineering innovation is going to be needed over the next few years to complement all of what's been discussed in this forum, and the role that financial intermediaries would play in ensuring that financial risk and de-risk instruments are built into the process of energy procurement, trading, etc., is going to be really important over the next few years.
Isaiah, it doesn't sound like you are all working on that. It doesn't sound like we have enough of it in place in order to try to achieve that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to get to your question about the importance of the local ecosystem, local partners, I mean, I think that ultimately when we talk about mobilizing this institutional investment, those institutional investors aren't going to actually go to the country and do the investments. They're going to find trust. It comes down to trust. I mean, we talk about it in risk, but it's ultimately trust. And having partners, whether they're fund managers, project developers, otherwise, local financial institutions that understand those markets, have the capacity and have a track record, which I think is something that we're supporting, but need to continue to do. That alone is going to make a huge difference, so that those investors, when they want to move money, they have folks they know they can trust and that they want to work with.
Yeah, is that your experience, Kavita? I saw you shaking your head when Thilan was talking about needing technical assistance.
No, definitely. I think one of the challenges, and I was in a meeting earlier where, small island nation countries also brought this up. Some of the financial institutions, the procedures of applying for it, the creation of the funding proposal that meets the standards of actually getting the funding, that if that capacity is lacking, then you don't even come to get to the funding. Right. So technical assistance plays a very important role. At GCF, we do have something called the Project Preparation Facility, where we take the risk of providing that fund upfront for the countries to develop, for private sector to develop the project. And if they bring the project to us and we successfully fund it, then we would seek the private sector to reimburse us. But if we don't, then that's lost money. So again, that's the type of risk I think more institutions need to take that. It's not enough, even though there might, this whole myth about there's a lot of capital but not enough project, I think I would like to spin it on its head and say that there's not enough risk capital to be able to develop the quality project that the non-risk finance that's sitting out there is willing to take that risk.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. Isaiah, I see you shaking your head vigorously.
Yeah.
Do we need to rethink that?
Yes, I mean, we do. I will say, one of the things that I love about my job is I get to interact with a lot of innovative thinkers in this space, and there are folks who are trying to come up with innovative models for what Kavita is mentioning, which is bringing more risky capital earlier in the process to build out that pipeline. And so I think it's a matter of just continuing to, accelerate some of those efforts and try to figure out a way to do it at scale, which is really challenging.
So I'm curious, when you say that, for those of us who may come in contact with a different part of finance, I mean, we have a very well developed VC private equity universe where everyone's looking for the next unicorn and take enormous risks and invest millions in companies that they never see another dime from. It doesn't sound like that's happening here, or is it just lack of knowledge? Because certainly that's happening in other parts of financial circles. What is your sense? Thilan, are you seeing, I mean, because there are huge returns. With risk comes potentially huge returns. Not always, but if you're doing it right.
No, that's a great point. I don't think there's enough concessional, or what we call blended capital, which is available at less than commercial rates in the world to help particularly the countries in the South to migrate towards decarbonization and renewables. So it is with that level of blended capital that we could actually encourage the global South to adopt modern technology, particularly when it comes to battery storage and other innovations in wind energy, and as I was mentioning earlier, pump storage. So I think the global capital pool, and certainly this is less riskier than venture capital or going after tech startups, need to expand vastly beyond the Jeff Bezoses, the Guggenheims, and the Gates Foundations of this world to actually make the billions into trillions, so that this blended capital, along with more institutional capital such as the GCF, can work in tandem, provide the technical assistance to the countries through companies such as Chemonix, and possibly ourselves, where we bring local knowledge to companies such as Chemonix, to actually help countries to migrate towards decarbonization and renewables. And it's a huge need. You're absolutely right, Maggie.
Yeah. I think energy is more challenging for venture-type investments because, at the end of the day, especially for the global South, affordable energy is linked to social and economic development. And then it's also hampered by regulations of the government, so policy and regulations, which luckily you don't have to deal with when you're setting up yet another e-commerce platform or a dating app, for example. But energy is difficult, and that has to be recognized. It is a more challenging sector to invest in. However, I think we have, more creative solutions. It's a matter of scaling them up. For GCF, we are looking at 3 types of energy transition demand for our capital. One is from decarbonizing the existing fossil, as Dylan mentioned. The second is actually in those countries such as Africa, which are just starting their growth journey. So actually scaling up. There's a huge opportunity to go green from start. And that's where I think more institutional capital needs to combine with us, which brings in the blending as a public institution and a private and commercial finance together, which could make the profit happen at the rates that they want. And then there is the energy access challenge. So where, again, we have funded a lot of enterprises through equity investments, with co-financing from private capital, actually, that has set up huge amounts of ecosystems within the local country context, which is now beginning to grow. But they don't see the same growth rate in capital investment as a developed country venture would see. I was speaking with this early stage developer. They still called early stage. They have been in the business for 10 years. If they were in the U.S. in 10 years, they no more called early stage, right? So it's a very successful enterprise, but they're still struggling to scale.
Yeah, that is the. Thielen, are there? You've kind of ridden the wave in Sri Lanka, had great success, saw it sort of move backwards, and now once again working on it. Are there lessons that we can take from that on what works, what moves the needle, and then what to avoid? You mentioned the need for, rule of law and standards, but what lessons should we take away from the Sri Lankan experience?
I think one of the key lessons would be transparency and competition in procurement. Nothing beats market pricing when it comes to energy procurement, where you would call for global tenders and invite the world to bid for a given energy project. And obviously, if you're issuing requests for proposals for such projects, we have to make sure that the ground situation of the government officials who negotiate with the successful bidders is conducted professionally with minimal, if no corruption whatsoever. So that becomes a crucial factor. Now, in Sri Lanka, we've seen, because of certain inefficiencies in the market, less and less interest compared to the late 90s by well-known international energy companies to bid for RFPs that have come out. Now that's got to change. Of course, the other lessons is fiscal responsibility within the energy off-takers. In Sri Lanka, it's been a monopoly so far. It's now getting unbundled. But what happened was the electricity monopoly also decided to get into the energy generation business of its own, because there were some donors who were willing to give money for that. For example, I don't want to mention a particular donor, but about 5 years back, I have actually objected to it. A well-known international donor gave the money to the state-owned electricity off-taker, go build a 100-megawatt wind energy plant, which we are now going to be looking at privatizing once unbundling happens. So these are some of the lessons. And I think the availability of blended and long-term patient capital such as GCF can be used as a stick or a carrot, so to speak, for governments to reform themselves when it comes to renewable energy. And you made a very interesting point earlier, and that is there is no other form of energy that is at the heart of the rural poor, whether it is for water pumping or small-scale irrigation or cultivation. The price of energy matters, or industrialization. The price of energy matters. So the government needs to have the best sources of financing, the cheapest sources of financing, and the most competitive, transparent procurement process in order to garner that benefit.
Isaiah, the political aspect of it, reform aspect of it, is big and thorny.
Yeah. I want to make one point that sort of builds off what Thielen's saying, which is the need for more blended finance tools, as well as the importance of transparent and competitive processes in some of this. So over the past 7 or 8 months, I've been working on something that's been sort of on the other side of what Thielon's is advocating for, which is running a structured competitive process for fund managers that are looking to raise capital to launch energy transition related funds focused on primarily the JETP countries, the Just Energy Transition Partnership countries. At the beginning of that process, a lot of people said, oh, we were looking at a minimum, basically $500 million fund, so pretty large scale. And a lot of folks kind of came up to us and said, we don't think that there's actually going to be, you might get a couple of fund managers who will come forward. We had $15 million in catalytic grant funding that we were going to provide to mobilize this money. And, lo and behold, we get 33 proposals with a lot of innovative concepts that are really structured specifically around mobilizing institutional capital, figuring out ways in which investment funds can be structured in a way that really meets their needs and speaks to what is going to take to push those institutional investors over the line and get money flowing.
So that sounds like an incredibly powerful message and sign if there's that much interest.
Yep.
And the role they play, would it be much like you're all playing as a sort of that intermediary between very large institutional money and the destination where it needs to go? Does it act as that sort of catalyst?
Exactly, yep. So we, essentially all those proposals were from GPs, general partners, who are the fund managers who are really the ones that are, going out and finding that pipeline of projects and really trying to push the needle and expanding that pipeline. And then on the other side, they're working with the institutional investors to make sure they're comfortable to bring them in, and then ultimately generate the returns that are going to meet their needs. Because when we talk about institutional investors, it's easy to say like, oh, you should invest, but sometimes they're responsible for managing teachers' pension funds.
Oh, absolutely. They have a lot of restrictions on the quality of the projects they're able to invest in to protect they have a fiduciary responsibility to stick by their mandate. Do we have any questions in the room while we're talking? If we do, just let me know or shout them out. Kavita, what's the pipeline look like? We heard the pipeline. I was showing Isaiah, because we are in the energy forum. But what does the project pipeline look like, and where you see the most interest?
For GCF, the demand for our capital is much higher than what our capital base is. So the project pipeline is not really the problem for us. It's raising the capital for ourselves is what is the bigger challenge. Having said that, I think the demand is diversified now. In our beginning, when GCF started operations, there was a lot of demand. Largely, most of the demand was for renewable energy. But now that more and more private capital and institutional capital have become familiar with renewable energy in developing countries, I think the demand for our capital has shifted somewhat. We are seeing a lot more demand in resilient agriculture. We are seeing a lot more demand in water and wastewater. We are seeing a lot more demand in what normally is called adaptive capacity and resilience building, resilient infrastructure that can withstand the increasing volatility of the climate impacts, the hurricanes, typhoon. So our demand base for capital is shifting. I also wanted to touch upon the point that Isaiah was making about the demand from a lot of general partners and fund managers has also increased to work with us. Now that we have created this whole body of investments, there's a lot of lessons that is embedded in our work, which we haven't been able to bring to the market. But general partners and fund managers now want to work more and more with us to be able to innovate before they can then go to institutional capital to use those examples into the market. So we do need more market players to capture the knowledge that we have, to be able to create sort of standardized valuation methodologies of what blended finance different stacks value is, so that the risk can be repriced appropriately. There's not enough model to do that for blended finance now. So if we need some more intermediaries in the system so that our money can go, our dollars can go further, faster.
Has it been, we all know anecdotally that there has the issue of ESG investing, sustainable investing can be politicized. There has been backlash. Do you feel any of that, or in terms of boots on the ground, is the interest high, and it's just a matter of ironing out some of these issues of de-risking and capacity building?
For GCF, we are a climate first. And we look at sustainability also, so not just do no harm, but also do good. So for a climate perspective, we have a well-developed methodology. We have our own integrated results management framework with very detailed methodology. Our systems are very transparent. So in fact, GCF's participation oftentimes for serious investors who want to be in climate or sustainability, that actually is very encouraging for them to come behind us. But that has not become a universal process yet.
Isaiah, what about you? What messaging do you think needs to happen to sort of draw more, especially when all of you are providing this really important bridge? What can pull more capital into these projects and close that funding gap?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest thing that I see is just the need for greater collaboration. I mean, Kavita and I were talking before about how our project is sort of working alongside GCF on multiple different initiatives. I think that a lot of us want to be able to put our name on something and say it's like our fund or our, but ultimately, like, what we're trying to do is we're trying to push forward a transformation that is arguably unprecedented in human history, and like we need to work together, and we need to find ways that people can feel pride and credit for these initiatives, but also work to pool capital together and collaborate.
Yeah, we keep coming back to strategic partnerships every conversation we have, but these problems are just too complex not to do that, even on the financing side. Thielen, last word to you. Are you feeling optimistic?
Yes, I am. In fact, if I may say so, Sri Lanka is probably the only country in the world that anticipated climate change 2,000 years ago when we built probably the world's finest irrigation canals and tanks on a cascading system to actually grow more food in some of the dry areas of Sri Lanka. So I think the time has come now where there's a greater degree of collaboration and innovation in blurring the lines between adaptation and mitigation, so that on the one hand, mitigation in the form of renewable energy can lead to better agricultural practices with more innovation and new technology coming in, and then of course linking it with water management. So that's the need of the hour. I think we need to go back to history, learn a few things, and adopt it to the modern world.
Well, thankfully, we have veterans like you who've been working at this public-private partnership for a long time to help guide us. And all of you, thank you for the really important work that you're doing to sort of, be that bridge and help us all understand these financing needs on a much more detailed level and not just the broad strokes. I think we need a more in-depth conversation on it. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you. Thank you. Oh, you're fine.
And now, please welcome to the stage Amos Hochstein, White House Deputy Assistant and Senior Advisor to the President for Energy and Investment, for a discussion on energy diplomacy with FP's Andrew Solinger.
No, we all do. It's the end of UNGA.
Hello, you're still here. How's everyone doing this afternoon? Let's get a rise of applause for Amos Hochstein, Special Presidential Coordinator for Global Infrastructure and Energy Security. Our final speaker. We're so pleased to have you here, Amos. We know you're super busy. In addition to the audience that we have here, we of course have we're broadcasting digitally, so there's plenty of people online as well. And we're really happy to end and conclude our discussion on energy transition with Amos today. So it's been a super busy week. You've been in lots of different discussions, I know. Today, as I was just explaining to you, we had Dr. Baral talking about the World Energy Report, an early peak fossil fuel prediction from them. We talked to Ambassador Sawaidi about COP28 and the ambitions and plans for COP28. Since then, we've been talking about critical minerals and how we manage those. Just now, private partnerships and investments. And we even had a little bit of a debate about permitting reform and whether or not net zero is an admirable goal. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, just to kick off and warm up, is what you've learned here at UNGA these couple of days in your discussions. Of course, you had many meetings. You were just explaining to me that you've been very focused on COP as well, but you're not really as interested in all this goal talk. Everyone's talking about setting a goal. You're more of a man of action. Would love to hear your take on that and why we need to be focused on action and not goals.
Well, first, thank you for having me, and it sounds like you don't really need to have me. You had everybody, and you covered all the topics, and so that's great. Look, I think everybody loves to complain about UNGA, right? Oh my God, everybody's here, it's crazy. But it's actually a time when you can do two things. You can see a lot of people in one place, you don't have to travel. And you get to exercise a lot because driving in the city during UNGA is terrible, so you have to walk miles and miles and miles to get anywhere. Either that or you're sitting in the motorcade and then you just feel totally ashamed that you're destroying everybody else's experience by doing that.
And producing emissions.
But the other thing, you can get a little bit of a pulse by not meeting with one person or one country at a time. You can get a pulse of how you feel things are going. And to that's really what you just asked. And I think there's a few takeaways for me that really, I don't know that I was surprised, but things that have really strengthened. And that is, President Biden likes to talk a lot about we're in an inflection. We're at a place of inflection right now. The world's in a place of inflection. A lot of changes and how we go from here, really we're in multiple areas. That inflection will decide how that goes, will be so determinative for the next several generations. So the war, obviously the war in Ukraine, always the war of aggression that Russia has imposed on us is shadows a little bit. And really that has been a subject of conversation. At the same time, climate has been something that is clearly Climate Week here, and UNGA bringing people together to talk about what is doable, what the danger is, and the fact that we have to focus on it. And I find that what President Biden has set out to do as president we're really seeing those results. If you look at what happened at the G20, President Xi didn't decide not to come. President Putin, for obvious reasons, wasn't there. And from G20 to here, the announcement the president has made, the leadership that he has taken of bringing different parts of the world together so that we're not just focused on one thing, but that actually we can face multiple crises at the same time. From climate and Ukraine to also what are we doing in making sure that the energy transition is just, that the infrastructure gap is narrowed, that we are able to focus on low and middle income countries, that we can focus our efforts differently to invest, not just assist, in corridors from Central Asia to Africa. The new thing that we just announced, the corridor from connecting South and Southeast Asia with Europe through the Middle East. These are not just announcements, all of them already had months of planning in advance and are ready to really implementation, and the same in Africa. So in the Libido corridor and the Trans-Africa corridor that we're trying to build. So these are really, what my takeaway is that the world is in an inflection point, that we're doing well in trying to bring everybody together, but there's so much ahead of us. And so much that needs to get done.
Okay, great. And so that's some hope, but it sounds like you see some critical mass of attention right now focused on this right now, which is wonderful. Maybe you could just share with us a little bit. What does, by the way, the Special Presidential Coordinator for Global Infrastructure and Energy Security do? What are your top priorities right now? What are you focused on?
I've been in the administration for 2.5, almost 3 years, and my title has changed a few times.
It has.
So really at the end of the day, I advise the president on energy issues at home and around the world in a way of how do we put the system together. So if we're trying to implement the IRA and the CHIPS Act and the Infrastructure Act, making sure that we have the supply chains. So you talked about critical minerals. What are we doing at home to make sure that you talked about permitting? How do we do everything we need to do quickly and to get the permits there? We, of course, can affect the federal, but there's state and local. And how do we get more of cleaner, responsible mining and processing so that we can have EVs that are made at home with components from home? But even if we do everything right, we're not going to be able to do it from home. So how do we get that supply chain from our partners, from Africa, from Indonesia, from Brazil, and everyone in between? So making sure that that's done, and it's done in a way that is sustainable. And then there are how do we fit our investment agenda around the world into our national security and national economic agenda? And those things have to come together. And how do we mobilize private finance and really change how the United States has done this traditionally to actually make not just development assistance, but augment that with trade assistance and investment and mobilize our companies with the G7 companies into developing and middle-income countries. That is what's going to help us across the board, and that's my job as president.
That sounds like a very exciting job. I like that, whatever the title is, if it changes continuously. So just to kind of rip the Band-Aid off, I've asked you already if you were in the room when President Biden met with President Netanyahu this past week, and your answer to that was?
We're in the room, but we're not going to talk about it.
But we're not going to talk about it. So let's have this conversation then in a let's talk about hypotheticals. Let's say there were a country that you were hoping would open up relations with another country, let's say, just as an example. And that country wanted a form of energy that is sometimes hotly debated around the world for its own development and its own renewable resources, and that would be nuclear energy. And it's a controversial topic in a lot of different circles. What would be kind of like your take, for example? First of all, your views on nuclear energy, nuclear power. It can be divisive, and in some countries, it's verboten. There's been horrible, obviously examples and reasons for that. What's your take on nuclear energy as a source for renewables?
So I'll leave the hypothetical because I think we don't have to touch the hypothetical. Look, the president went to Saudi Arabia and Israel last July. He has openly said yesterday at the meeting that if there's a way to achieve a normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, that is a priority and a goal for the United States. We're a long way from that. We're having those conversations. We'll see where it takes us. But let's discuss the nuclear. My view, and I think the administration is taking this view, that I know that there are strong feelings about this that are merited, that have are anchored in a lot of merit. However, it's hard for me to imagine us getting to the net zero goals and to have a cleaner world without nuclear. So I know people like talking codes. I'm going to be as simple. I believe that not only should we support nuclear, we should be out there and trying to make it happen. I fully support that. And that means that we should do it responsibly, but we should help finance it. We should help the R&D side on getting SMRs, Generation 3, ready to be deployed, Generation 4, that's not quite ready to be deployed, but we should invest in it. And we should be the leader on the science side, because that's what we do. We innovate and we invest in R&D in order to get that innovation to market. So I think it's a source of clean energy that is important. And I would say I don't know how you do it without it. The math doesn't add up.
I mean, it's not tomorrow, but we can get to net zero much faster and beyond with more nuclear energy. I mean,
we are using American government dollars and efforts for an SMR in Romania, in a whole host of countries that we are supportive of getting to the ability to develop nuclear power.
Since we're not talking hypotheticals, the founding of Aramco was really a joint venture between the Standard Oil of the U.S. and the Arabian Oil. It's called the Arabian American Oil Company. It was founded in that way in the 30s, and since now it's fully Saudi, of course. Is that a model for any country that we might joint venture with to create a nuclear energy infrastructure?
I would not go on. I would not use models. I think that we are in 2023, and we should use the data that we have today and what we're trying to achieve, and make sure that we can do it safely, securely. But as far as this is not just about Saudi Arabia.
Sure.
This is globally. I just believe that we should do more to support the growth in the nuclear power industry, civilian nuclear power industry.
Excellent. Let's move to, you mentioned the Ukraine-Russia war and just generally oil prices now. I mentioned to you that we had Dr. Barol here from the IEA talking about the new World Energy Report. First of all, just kind of curious what your take is on that. Peak oil, 2030, do you think that's eye-roll worthy or genuine? Who knows? Obviously, it's hard to make those predictions. He says he has all the data.
I'm sure he does. He's a very good economist. He was the chief economist of the IEA before. He became the head of the organization. We fully support Dr. Barol. I think it doesn't. We should work with our goals of where we're trying to take the world and how do we implement that. And I don't know that whether we can have this conversation in UNGA 2030 and we'll say, did we reach peak or not? I think those are things that are data driven on the one hand, but they're also driven on circumstance, and I don't know what's going to happen in the world between now and then. For now, demand is rising. It's rising across oil, gas, and coal. So the first thing we need to do is do whatever we can to stop the rise in coal. We should stop the rise in everything, but coal has to come first. We need to get rid of coal in our energy system. That is a lot harder than it sounds. And if we just say things like, oh, let's just get rid of coal or we'll stop doing this or that, we have to base what we're hoping for and our goals with reality of what is achievable. And that's how you get coal out of the power system, by making sure you have the replacement for it and that you don't create disruptions. So as we look forward, we need to focus on two things and do them at the same time with as much vigor. One is to accelerate the energy transition, to make sure that we can get all the things you talked about all day today. Get those supply chains, get those permits, and get EVs to be further deployed, charging stations to get rid of range anxiety, more deployment of solar and wind, make them faster. Don't take 5 to 7 years to deploy a wind power project. But at the same time, make sure we have an energy market that can still sustain us today while we're in this transition, so that we don't have energy shocks that leads to economic shocks. So that is a delicate balance, and that is what the President Biden wants to do and has been seeking to do. Put this in a context of implementing the IRA and the CHIPS Act and the Infrastructure Act will take us there. We have to go there faster than the pace that we're in right now. But we have to understand the ecosystem that we're in. We have to, as we take off fossil fuel projects, we have to bring on the alternatives. And in the meantime, make sure that whatever fossil project is still there should be as clean as possible and decarbonized, so that even if we have to suffer through more years of hydrocarbons, they should at least be cleaner than they are today and decarbonized.
Just to move to a specific sector, industrial emissions, for a minute. The administration has said, indicated that it would focus in Part 2, Biden administration Part 2, on limiting industrial emissions, a huge source of carbon. I'm curious, if you've done any work on that, if that's something that we're focused on, specifically industrials. Hard to abate sectors, by the way, require all sorts of new tools. Hydrogen in some of these sectors, of course. Is that something that you've also been turning your attention to?
Well, we need to do this globally, not just in the United States. Hard to abate sectors are obviously named for a reason. We have to come up with solutions. I think that the advantage that we have, and what we've seen since President Biden was able to pass these legislation, is the amount of capital flow into R&D and companies that are willing now to invest in it. What you're seeing is and we're going to need that, because we need the new ways of addressing it. We have to bring down the cost of clean hydrogen so that it could be a critical piece of the hard-to-abate sectors. We have to, and that connects to what I said earlier on decarbonizing the fossil fuel industry. We have to, this is what it means, is reducing the emissions, reducing flaring, reducing the actual emissions for the products that we still need. And that's going to be a goal here. But I worry that we talk too much about what we're doing in the United States and in Europe and in Japan and elsewhere, and we don't talk enough about how do we make sure that we're doing this in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia and South America and across the world. Because if you look at where the dollars are going, just judge it based on where's the money, right? Show me the money. And the money is going to OECD countries by significant margin. And despite all the statements that we had from the corporate side, the rate of non-OECD investment is going down. So we have to address that, because otherwise, hard to abate. You can bring down, to Fatih's point, demand in order to get peak demand. But what happens with the part of the world that's growing the fastest, that doesn't have the resources, where the cost of investment is so much higher? because of there's currency risk and there's country risk and there's commodity risk and there's reputational risk. And those mean that the companies that say, okay, fine, I'm willing to invest and I'm willing to finance. Oh, but the returns that are necessary in those countries are much higher. So if I want to get to lower emissions globally, we need to bring the rest of the world with us. And I think that's something that we are going to focus on, increasingly focus more and more on.
We're out of time right now. Maybe you could give us an example of a focus on that global south, on the L mix, and some of that development that we can look forward to, that we could watch for perhaps in the coming year.
We at the G7 last year, when we launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment (PGI) together with the G7. This year at the G7, the president announced something called the Lobito Corridor and Trans-African Rail. And that is building rail that will go from the port of Lobito in Angola all the way through to DRC and Zambia and eventually to the East Coast. And bringing with it, with that infrastructure, comes all the other investments that we want to incentivize. We've already done over $1 billion of renewable energy projects in that region. We are set to announce another $1 billion there, and these are not assistance projects. These are investments. These are finance, debt, equity that we are doing there so that we can deploy more. What happens once you do the first 1 or 2 or 3 projects, you can replicate them. Then it's the rinse repeat. Now you have the model of how to do it. You're creating a supply chain internally. Along the route of this rail, Angola used to import food, and now it is developing its own food security. And if we can move along that rail so that it doesn't take critical minerals 5 weeks to go by truck from DRC or Zambia all the way to Durban, which increases the cost of EVs and so on, but rather 4 days to go to the port by rail, well, now that's one benefit. And food security, if I can bring the agriculture sector in and they say, wait a minute, what do you want me to do with food that I'm going to do agribusiness in landlocked countries that take 5 weeks? I don't have refrigerated trucks that are going to go across Africa. But if I have a rail that's doing it, so suddenly the rail is not just about the critical mineral, it's about lifting communities, creating a whole corridor of investment that is cleaner, more sustainable. And lifts the communities that are around it, instead of just coming in and repeating the resource curse of the 20th century and repeating it into the 21st century of the clean energy. We're already on the road to repeating several of the mistakes of the 20th century oil and gas world by having a limited number of countries that we're all beholden to. And if we now have that where China has 60% of the investment in the mining and processing, I have no objection to China being a clean energy country and being involved in the market. But we need a diversified market that operates like a market. And so that we have access to the inputs for electric vehicles equally around the world. These are the kinds of investments that we are doing now that we've never done before. And so I'm really excited about what we're doing. The president has announced some of this very publicly, so a lot of pressure on me to deliver, because he's a man who expects
so we won't
implementation.
We won't wait until UNGA 2030 to ask you about those, and if those have been delivered on. We're action oriented as discussed, not necessarily looking at future goals. But we're out of time right now. But I really want to appreciate you ending on that high note. That is that we had our food discussion yesterday, in fact. So that was it's very timely to talk about that. And we had Agnes Kalabata of AGRA in here talking about that exact issue and the inability to move product in Africa. So it's great to hear we're making strides in that way.
We have to mitigate the risks and open the corridors so that the private capital comes in. That's our job. That's the World Bank's job. That's the MDB's. That's what we need to do. I'm very optimistic about what we can achieve going forward.
Thank you. Ending on a note of optimism. Amos Hochstein, everyone. Thank you so much for coming in. Really appreciate your time. I'm going to close this down right now. I'll be there in a second. So that brings to a conclusion our programming on energy. Thank you so much. Just a couple of notes. I wanted to thank our partners who made this discussion possible and make sure we recognize them. Anglo-American, Chemonics, Florida International University, and GM. And I also want to point out that we'll be running a lot of programs at COP28 in Dubai in December. So talk to myself if you're interested in learning more about that. And then finally, I want to make sure that we remind you that we're going to be right back here at 6 o'clock for our podcast taping of Global Reboot. So come back and join us, and we'll have drinks and snacks around that too. And I don't know that they're in the room, but since this is the last time I'll be up here, I want to thank the incredible events team of Foreign Policy for incredible programming that we put together. It really went very well. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Really appreciate your time and your energy and your focus. Thanks.